In early July 1947, the desert landscape outside Roswell became the site of an event that would resist clear explanation, as scattered debris stretched across remote ranchland under conditions that suggested more than an ordinary crash. Initial observations described a wide field of unfamiliar material, light enough to carry yet resistant to damage, lying across terrain shaped by wind, isolation, and silence, before military personnel arrived and quietly secured the area. What followed was not simply recovery, but removal, swift, controlled, and largely undocumented in ways that would later leave more questions than answers. As this unfolds, you move through each stage of the event as it was recorded and remembered, tracing the path from that silent desert to the facilities, reports, and decisions that followed. The details that emerge, locations, witness accounts, and technical observations, begin to form a pattern, one that reveals not only what may have been recovered, but how it was handled, studied, and ultimately obscured from clear explanation. A signal lost in the New Mexico desert. In the early days of July 1947, southeastern New Mexico lay under a sky that seemed too quiet for the kind of event that would soon be whispered about across the country. A wide and open landscape where distant storms rolled in slowly, and the horizon stretched without interruption, leaving little room for anything to go unnoticed. Ranchlands near Roswell were sparsely populated, defined by dry grass, scattered fencing, and long distances between neighbouring properties, and it was precisely this isolation that would make what occurred there both difficult to witness and impossible to ignore once fragments began to appear. Nothing about the setting suggested that it would become the centre of one of the most persistent questions in modern history, yet the stillness of that desert would soon be broken by something that did not behave like the remains of an ordinary accident. Accounts from that period describe an unusual disturbance during the night between July 2nd and July 3rd, when a powerful storm system moved across the region, bringing thunder strong enough to rattle windows and flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the ground in stark detail. Within that storm, several individuals later recalled hearing a sound that did not fully resemble thunder, described in some reports as a sharp explosion or a sudden crack that seemed closer to the ground than the sky. Though these recollections were not formally recorded until years later, the timing of this disturbance would become important, not because it was immediately investigated, but because it marked the moment when something appeared to enter the landscape with force, leaving behind physical traces that could not easily be explained by weather alone. By the morning that followed, the desert showed no obvious signs of impact from a distance, yet what would later be described by witnesses suggests that whatever came down did not strike in a single, concentrated location. Instead, the pattern that emerged pointed toward a wide dispersal of material across a remote ranching area, as though an object had broken apart before or during its descent. This detail would become central to the earliest interpretations of the event, as a scattered debris field typically indicates structural failure at altitude rather than a direct crash into the ground. Yet the nature of the fragments themselves would complicate that assumption. The region where the material was later found lay northwest of Roswell, on land used primarily for grazing, an environment where unfamiliar objects would stand out immediately against the muted tones of soil and vegetation. Unlike wreckage from known aircraft of the time, which would have included recognizable components such as engines, wiring, or identifiable metal panels, the reported debris did not conform to those expectations. Early descriptions, preserved in interviews conducted decades later, referred to lightweight materials, thin metallic strips, and pieces that appeared manufactured yet lacked any clear mechanical function, suggesting that what had come down was not simply damaged. It was structurally unlike anything typically recovered from aviation incidents in the 1940s. One of the more telling aspects of the initial event is not what was seen immediately, but what was not. There were no reports of a smoking crater visible from afar, no immediate response teams dispatched in the hours following the storm, and no widespread recognition that something unusual had occurred. This absence of an obvious crash site is significant, as it suggests that the object either disintegrated before impact or struck the ground, in a way that did not produce a singular point of destruction. In conventional aircraft accidents, even when debris is scattered, there is often a central location where the largest components come to rest. Yet in this case, early accounts imply a field of fragments rather than a focal wreckage. As the days passed, the physical nature of what had occurred began to take shape through indirect observation rather than immediate investigation. The distribution of debris, as later described, extended over a considerable distance, reinforcing the idea that whatever had descended did so under conditions that caused it to break apart prior to landing. This pattern aligns with high-altitude structural failure, yet it raises questions about the material itself, as objects designed for atmospheric flight typically leave behind recognizable elements even when destroyed. The absence of such elements in the reported debris field would later become one of the central inconsistencies in official explanations. The broader context of 1947 also plays a role in understanding how the event was initially perceived, as the United States was entering a period of heightened attention to aerial technology and unidentified objects in the sky. Only weeks earlier, pilot Kenneth Arnold had reported seeing unusual flying objects near Mount Rainier, a sighting that led to the popularization of the term flying saucer in newspapers across the country. This atmosphere of emerging curiosity meant that any unusual occurrence in the sky could quickly become part of a larger narrative. Yet the Roswell incident differed in one critical way. It involved physical material on the ground, not just something seen at a distance. The distinction between sighting and recovery is essential, as it shifts the event from speculation to something that could, in theory, be examined, measured, and identified. While many reports from that era relied on visual accounts that were difficult to verify, the presence of debris introduces the possibility of direct analysis, making the nature of that material central to any explanation. It is this transition, from something observed in the sky to something handled on the ground, that transforms the Roswell event into a case of physical recovery rather than mere observation, and it's precisely this aspect that would later become obscured by conflicting statements and missing documentation. In examining the earliest phase of the incident, it becomes clear that the defining feature is not a single dramatic moment, but a series of subtle indicators that something unusual had occurred. A storm passes, an unfamiliar sound is heard, and fragments begin to appear across a remote landscape, each detail on its own unremarkable, yet together forming a pattern that suggests more than coincidence. The lack of immediate clarity allowed interpretations to shift over time, but the physical evidence, however briefly accessible, remained the anchor of the story. What makes this initial stage particularly difficult to reconstruct is the delay between the event itself and the attention it eventually received, as the discovery of the debris did not occur under controlled conditions or official observation. Instead, it was found by individuals whose primary concern was the land they managed, not the implications of what lay scattered across it. This gap between occurrence and recognition introduces uncertainty, yet it also preserves a moment before official narratives were established, a brief window in which the material existed without explanation or classification. As later investigations and statements attempted to define the event, the question of whether it was a crash or a simple dispersal of debris remained unresolved, largely because the characteristics of the material did not fully support either scenario. A conventional crash would leave identifiable wreckage, while a mere scattering of debris would not account for the unusual properties attributed to the fragments. This ambiguity is not a weakness of the case, but rather one of its most persistent features, as it suggests that the event does not fit neatly into established categories of aviation or atmospheric phenomena. The early silence surrounding the incident would not last, and within days, the discovery of the debris would draw the attention of authorities whose involvement would reshape the narrative entirely, introducing official explanations that would later be questioned and revised. Yet before that intervention, the desert held a scattered record of something that had entered the landscape with force, left behind material that defied easy identification, and vanished from the immediate understanding as quickly as it had appeared. That recognition would come from a rancher who stepped into a field of unfamiliar fragments and realized that what he was seeing could not be dismissed as ordinary. The rancher who found something unfamiliar. On the outskirts of a remote ranching expanse near Roswell in 1947, daily routines unfolded with a predictability shaped by distance, where long stretches of land separated human activity, and the horizon often remained uninterrupted for hours at a time. In such environments, time was measured less by events and more by repetition, with work tied to grazing land, weather shifts, and the maintenance of fences that marked property across a landscape that rarely changed in visible ways. It was a place where silence was not unusual, and where even distant sounds carried clearly across open ground because there was so little to break their passage. Within that familiar rhythm of isolation, the land itself became something that was known in detail by those who worked it, down to the subtle differences in soil texture, the patterns left by wind, and the movement of animals across specific paths. It was precisely this kind of familiarity that made even small disruptions noticeable when they occurred, not because they were dramatic at first glance, but because they did not fit into the established understanding of how the terrain usually behaved. In a place where everything had its expected form, anything that broke that expectation carried weight, even before it was understood. Within that familiar pattern of quiet labour, small irregularities in the terrain could easily go unnoticed, unless they disrupted something already well understood, and it was in this kind of setting that an unusual presence began to break the normal order of the landscape. The initial impression was not one of a single, obvious object, but rather of scattered elements that seemed to interrupt the continuity of the ground itself, as though something had passed through the area and left behind fragments without a clear centre point. This absence of a focal source made the discovery less immediately interpretable, as there was no single location to identify as the origin. At closer range, what appeared across the ground did not immediately resemble anything tied to routine ranch activity, as scattered fragments lay in positions that suggested they had not simply fallen in place, but had arrived there under conditions that were not immediately identifiable. Some accounts later associated with the event describe materials that appeared unusually light for their size, shifting easily when handled and resisting the expected rigidity of conventional metal or wood, though these descriptions were not formalized at the time of discovery. The arrangement of the debris did not form a clear pattern of collapse, nor did it suggest a direct concentrated impact, but instead extended across a wider area in a way that complicated any immediate explanation. Against familiar reference points such as weather debris, agricultural equipment, or known aircraft wreckage from the period, the scattered material resisted easy classification, leaving only uncertainty where recognition should have been immediate. In the mid-1940s, rural regions were not unfamiliar with remnants of mechanical activity, particularly from aircraft passing through military training routes, yet those materials typically carried identifiable structures, engines, wiring, or recognizable frames that allowed even damaged wreckage to be categorized without difficulty. What was present here, however, did not immediately offer those reference points, creating a gap between expectation and observation that could not be quickly resolved through experience alone. Some later descriptions associated with the discovery emphasized the lack of conventional weight or structural response in the material, suggesting that certain fragments behaved in ways that defied simple handling, though such claims emerged in retrospective accounts rather than immediate documentation. What remains consistent across early references is not a detailed technical analysis, but rather the persistence of uncertainty, an inability to match what was seen with anything previously encountered in that environment. In this way, the material did not just appear unusual, it resisted classification entirely within the knowledge available at the time. Without immediate external confirmation or guidance, the presence of unfamiliar material in an isolated environment created a situation defined less by urgency and more by uncertainty, where observation replaced interpretation for a period of time. The remoteness of the location meant that there were no structured systems for rapid reporting or analysis, and the absence of immediate institutional presence allowed the discovery to remain in a purely observational state longer than it might have in a more populated or monitored area. During this period, the material existed in a kind of informational limbo, where it was seen but not yet defined. The isolation also meant that the responsibility for interpretation initially rested entirely on those who encountered it directly, without external frameworks to provide immediate categorization. In such conditions, even experienced individuals would naturally attempt to compare unfamiliar findings against known references, searching for parallels in weather events, mechanical failure, or environmental disturbance. Yet the consistency of the fragment's unusual characteristics prevented a stable comparison, reinforcing the sense that what lay on the ground did not conform to familiar categories of damage or debris. Eventually, the practical limitations of isolation and the unusual nature of the discovery made continued private observation unsustainable, leading to steps that would bring the matter beyond the boundaries of the ranch itself. This transition was not driven by dramatic urgency, but rather by the recognition that the material did not resolve into any clear explanation through continued observation alone, and that its presence required a form of external assessment that was not locally available. Once outside attention entered the situation, the material and the circumstances surrounding it shifted beyond the control of a single observer, transitioning into a process governed by external authority and formal examination. At that point, the original context of discovery, quiet land, isolated work and unstructured observation, began to recede, replaced by procedures and interests that no longer centered on the environment in which the fragments were first encountered. The material itself remained unchanged, but its meaning was no longer determined by those who first saw it. What began as a quiet encounter with something unfamiliar soon moved beyond the land where it was first seen, when the military changed its story overnight. Following the moment when outside attention reached the ranch, the material that had been quietly observed began to enter a wider informational space where its description was no longer shaped solely by those who first encountered it. What had started as a private and localized observation was now exposed to systems of communication that operated under different pressures, where speed, hierarchy, and classification often influenced how early impressions were recorded. In that transition, the event no longer remained anchored to the land itself, but began to exist as information moving through structured channels that filtered what was emphasized and what was reduced. Within a very short period, references to an unusual recovery in the region began circulating beyond local boundaries, appearing in official communication channels that framed the situation in a manner distinct from its initial private observation. The wording used in these early references did not linger on uncertainty or gradual interpretation, but instead presented the situation in a way that suggested immediate categorization had already taken place. This shift is significant not because it explains the material, but because it demonstrates how quickly interpretation can precede full understanding when information moves beyond its point of origin. Under that early public framing, the recovered material was described using terminology that suggested an unidentified aerial origin, a choice of wording that immediately placed the incident into a category unfamiliar to conventional explanations of the time. The phrasing itself did not emerge from detailed technical analysis made available to the public, but rather from brief official communication that carried the weight of institutional authority. In that moment, the event was no longer just something found in an isolated field. It had become something defined before the details surrounding it had been fully examined. Almost immediately after this initial framing reached public awareness, the language used to describe the event began to shift, introducing alternate explanations that altered how the recovery was being understood without changing the underlying reported facts. This rapid adjustment created a visible tension between initial description and subsequent clarification, as though the same event was being reinterpreted in real time. What had been presented as a direct identification was now being reframed in a way that removed the original implication, leaving behind a gap between what was first stated and what was later emphasized. From within official channels, a revised explanation emerged that redirected attention away from earlier descriptions, replacing the initial characterization with a more conventional interpretation that conflicted with how the event had first been presented. This adjustment did not introduce entirely new information so much as it recontextualized existing details, shifting the focus away from unusual classification and toward a more grounded explanation. The result was not simply clarification, but transformation, where the meaning of the same event changed depending on which version of the communication was being referenced. As differing accounts circulated in close succession, the event entered a state where multiple interpretations coexisted without clear resolution, leaving the public narrative fragmented between competing descriptions of the same recovery. This overlap did not produce a unified understanding, but instead created parallel versions of the story, each supported by official timing but not fully aligned with the others. In that condition, the focus began to shift away from the physical recovery itself and toward the instability of its description. What made this period particularly unusual was not only the change in wording, but the speed at which those changes occurred, as if the narrative was being actively corrected in response to how it was received. The result was a layered record in which no single description remained stable long enough to fully define the event on its own. Instead, meaning accumulated through contradiction, and understanding became dependent on comparing versions rather than relying on a single account. In the aftermath of these rapid shifts in description, the earliest version of the event's identification gradually faded from official emphasis, leaving only the revised account as the dominant public reference point. Over time, the initial framing became less visible in formal summaries and public memory, replaced by language that aligned with the later interpretation. What remained was not a continuous narrative, but a sequence of adjustments that had altered the same incident more than once in a very short span of time, without ever fully returning to its starting point. The significance of this transition lies not in determining which version was correct, but in observing how quickly interpretation can become fixed, while underlying uncertainty remains unresolved. The material at the centre of the event did not change during this process, yet its meaning was repeatedly reassigned as it moved through different layers of communication. In this way, the recovery itself became secondary to the way it was described, corrected, and ultimately stabilised into a form that no longer resembled its first public introduction. Even without access to the original physical evidence, the structure of the narrative reveals a consistent pattern of acceleration, followed by revision, where early certainty gives way to adjustment before settling into a more conventional explanation. This pattern does not resolve the questions surrounding the event, but it does establish how quickly control over interpretation can shift once information leaves its point of origin and enters broader institutional awareness. By the time public understanding settled into its later form, the earliest framing had already been absorbed, replaced, and largely detached from the official record of discussion. What remained was a version of events that appeared coherent in isolation, but less stable when viewed alongside its earlier iterations. The gap between those versions became part of the history itself, not as a conclusion, but as an unresolved transition in how the same recovery was presented over time. The initial description gradually gave way to a different explanation that would lead deeper into the question of what the recovered material actually was. Materials that did not behave like metal. With public explanations settling into a revised form, attention gradually moved away from narrative interpretation and began to concentrate on the physical remnants that had already been removed from immediate scrutiny. At this stage, the incident was no longer being shaped primarily by shifting descriptions or public corrections, but by what remained physically unexamined in public view. The emphasis subtly changed from how the event was being explained to what, precisely, had been taken away before any sustained independent assessment could take place, leaving the material itself at the centre of growing uncertainty. In this shift, the story stopped expanding outward and instead narrowed toward the question of substance, what those fragments actually were, and why their defining characteristics never stabilized in public understanding. Descriptions associated with the recovered material repeatedly returned to a central difficulty in identifying its basic physical nature when compared against known construction elements of mid-20th century aviation. In later accounts, the challenge was not presented as a matter of speculation, but as a practical limitation in matching observed characteristics to established categories of materials used in aircraft design at the time. This was significant because aviation technology in the 1940s already relied on well-understood materials such as aluminum alloys, steel components, and fabric-reinforced structures, each with predictable structural responses. Yet the reported descriptions did not consistently align with those reference points, creating a persistent gap between what was familiar and what was being described. Under handling conditions described in later accounts, certain fragments were noted for responding in ways that did not align with expected structural density or rigidity typical of conventional metallic components. Instead of behaving as uniform load-bearing material, some pieces were described in terms that suggested irregular flexibility or unusual resistance to deformation, as though their response changed depending on how they were handled or viewed. While these descriptions do not constitute technical measurements, they are important because they consistently emphasize the same difficulty. The material did not present a stable set of characteristics that could be easily categorized through ordinary comparison. When measured against familiar materials used in aircraft manufacturing during the 1940s, including aluminum-based alloys and reinforced composite structures, the reported characteristics failed to establish consistent equivalence. Standard aviation materials of the period were not only widely used but also well documented in terms of behavior under stress, heat, and impact, making post-accident identification relatively straightforward in most cases. Even severely damaged aircraft debris typically retains identifiable structural signatures, such as rivet patterns, fracture behavior, or layered construction. In contrast, the descriptions tied to the recovered fragments did not consistently match these expectations, leaving comparisons unresolved rather than confirmatory. Attempts to assign the fragments to recognized material categories repeatedly encountered limitations, as expected markers of identification, such as uniform density, structural fracture patterns, or standard machining traces, were reportedly absent or inconsistent. This lack of clear diagnostic features is notable because material classification in engineering relies on repeatable indicators that allow even degraded samples to be traced back to known manufacturing processes. The accounts associated with this recovery suggest that such indicators were either unclear, incomplete, or insufficiently consistent to support a stable classification, which meant the material resisted categorization at multiple levels rather than just one. Each subsequent description of the material introduced slight variations in how its properties were perceived, preventing any single interpretation from stabilizing into a definitive classification. Over time, this created not just uncertainty, but accumulation of partial perspectives, where different observers emphasized different traits without producing a unified profile. In some descriptions, the emphasis was on weight or handling behavior, while in others it was on appearance or structural response. Yet none of these perspectives fully reconciled with the others. This layering of incomplete impressions reinforced the sense that the material did not present itself in a consistent or easily definable way. As observation continued over time, access to the physical fragments became increasingly constrained, gradually reducing opportunities for independent examination and shifting focus away from direct handling. What had begun as a situation grounded in physical proximity slowly transitioned into one defined by limited visibility, where understanding depended less on direct observation and more on secondary accounts. In this phase, the material itself became less accessible not only physically, but also interpretively, as fewer consistent descriptions remained available for comparison. Over time, even the language used to describe the fragments became more fragmented, reflecting the lack of a stable reference point rather than resolving it. Without consistent access or unified documentation, the material existed increasingly as a set of descriptions rather than a continuously observable object. This shift is important because it marks the point where physical evidence begins to separate from public reconstruction, leaving interpretation to fill the gaps created by absence. The withdrawal of the material from direct examination marked the point where its physical presence began to matter less than its uncertain path afterward. The silent transfer, tracking where the debris went. As the physical examination phase receded from immediate focus, attention shifted toward the subsequent handling of the recovered material once it left the conditions under which it had been first observed. The change was not marked by a single decisive moment, but by a gradual transition in where the narrative emphasis began to settle. Instead of continued discussion about appearance or behavior, the focus moved toward what happened after direct observation became limited, and how the material itself entered a system of controlled movement that was no longer tied to its original location or those who first encountered it. From the point where the fragments were no longer accessible in their original setting, their movement into external custody marked the beginning of a process defined by relocation rather than observation. At this stage, the material ceased to exist in a context shaped by environmental conditions or first-hand handling, and instead became part of a structured sequence in which its physical presence was tracked through transfer rather than examined in place. This transition is significant because it marks the first point at which the material's trajectory becomes as important as its properties, shifting the focus from what it was described as to where it was directed. During the initial stage of transfer, the handling of the material followed a pattern consistent with organized movement rather than incidental relocation, suggesting a controlled progression between secured points. In practical terms, this implies that the fragments were not simply stored locally or left in temporary possession, but instead entered a process that involved deliberate routing. While the specifics of this movement are not always detailed in a continuous public record, the structure implied by later references suggests coordination across more than one facility, each serving a distinct role in the progression from recovery to further handling. At a subsequent stage of documented movement, references place the material within a broader operational network that included established military infrastructure associated with reporting and evaluation functions. One of the locations frequently associated with this phase is the area linked to Fort Worth in Texas, where military facilities were known at the time to handle reporting, assessment, and communication functions related to aviation incidents. In this context, the presence of recovered material within such a setting does not necessarily imply final analysis, but rather an intermediate stage where information and physical evidence could be reviewed or relayed through formal channels. Within this transitional phase, the material was no longer associated with its point of recovery, but instead with controlled environments where its presence was managed under institutional oversight. This separation from its origin is important because it removes the material from the conditions that initially defined its discovery, placing it instead within systems designed for handling, documentation, and potential evaluation. At this stage, the focus is no longer on the landscape or the initial discovery conditions, but on the procedural pathways through which physical evidence is processed once it enters structured custody. Under continued transfer conditions, accounts indicate that the recovered material was directed toward facilities associated with centralized technical assessment, marking a shift from movement to potential examination. One such location often referenced in relation to broader post-recovery handling is Wright Field in Ohio, a site historically connected with aviation research and technical analysis within military infrastructure. The significance of this stage lies not in confirmed outcomes, but in the implication that materials of uncertain origin were being routed toward environments equipped for deeper evaluation, where classification and technical interpretation could, in theory, take place. As the chain of custody progressed, direct visibility of the material diminished, and its presence became increasingly defined by references to controlled handling rather than physical observation. In this phase, the material exists less as an observable object and more as a documented item within a sequence of transfers, where its location is known in terms of institutional movement but not in terms of continuous public accessibility. This gradual reduction in visibility contributes to the broader uncertainty surrounding the recovery, not because the material disappears abruptly, but because its trace becomes progressively mediated through controlled systems of movement and record keeping. Over time, this transition from open observation to structured custody creates a gap between what was initially encountered and what can later be verified through available accounts. The material, once tied directly to a specific place and moment, becomes increasingly abstracted through its relocation, existing more as a point within a chain than as a continuously observable entity. In this sense, the movement itself becomes part of the narrative, not as an explanation of origin, but as a record of how physical evidence is separated from its initial context and integrated into broader systems of handling. What emerges from this progression is not a conclusion about the nature of the material, but an outline of how quickly physical evidence can move beyond direct observation once it enters structured custody. Each stage of transfer reduces the immediacy of first-hand context, replacing it with procedural distance that separates the object from the environment in which it was first encountered. This separation does not resolve questions about the material itself, but it does establish a clear pattern of movement that continues beyond its point of origin. The final stage of transfer marked the point where the material ceased to be tracked as a moving object and began to exist within a secured environment beyond public view. Inside Wright-Patterson, the first known analysis point. Upon completion of structured transfer procedures, the recovered material is described as entering an environment associated with technical evaluation, where its handling shifted from movement-based custody to controlled examination conditions. At this stage, the narrative focus no longer centers on where the material came from or how it was transported, but on the type of setting in which it was placed once it reached a point of technical oversight. This transition marks a subtle but important change in the story, where the unknown object is no longer defined by its journey, but by the systems now tasked with interpreting it. Within established research settings linked to aviation and materials assessment, procedures of the period were typically organized around systematic inspection of physical evidence brought in from external incidents. Facilities associated with military research infrastructure in the mid-20th century were designed to evaluate a wide range of materials, particularly those connected to aircraft performance, structural failure, and unexplained mechanical incidents. In that context, any unfamiliar debris entering such environments would have been subject to structured comparison against known standards of composition and engineering design, using methods grounded in existing scientific and industrial knowledge of the time. At the point where the material was introduced into an analytical framework, its connection to the conditions of recovery was no longer the primary reference point guiding its handling or categorization. Instead, the focus shifted toward isolating its physical characteristics from the circumstances of its discovery, allowing it to be assessed as an independent sample. This separation is a critical step in any technical evaluation process, as it removes environmental context in order to concentrate on measurable properties, even though the origin of the material may still influence the broader questions surrounding its classification. Under examination conditions characteristic of mid-20th century technical facilities, evaluation processes generally relied on comparative testing against known structural and metallurgical standards. Materials were typically analysed through their response to stress, heat, and mechanical manipulation, as well as through visual inspection of structural composition and fracture behaviour. In aviation-related research environments, such comparisons were essential for identifying whether recovered components matched known aircraft construction techniques or indicated unfamiliar manufacturing processes that required further investigation. Inside such structured environments, interpretation of physical samples was typically guided by layered assessment methods designed to identify composition, durability, and manufacturing origin where possible. These methods were not speculative in nature, but grounded in established scientific procedures intended to reduce ambiguity by comparing unknown samples against extensive reference knowledge. The process was incremental, often moving from basic physical observation to more detailed analysis, each stage intended to narrow the range of possible classifications until a coherent identification could be established. Beyond the confines of these controlled settings, details regarding internal evaluation processes remained largely inaccessible, leaving external understanding dependent on indirect references and partial accounts. This separation between internal procedure and external visibility is a defining feature of technical research environments, particularly those associated with sensitive or specialized materials. As a result, what is known about the examination phase is shaped less by continuous documentation and more by fragmented descriptions that emerge outside the immediate context of analysis. In cases where materials did not align cleanly with established reference categories, the evaluation process would reach a threshold where classification became uncertain rather than conclusively defined. This does not necessarily imply a lack of analytical rigor, but rather highlights the limitations of existing reference systems when confronted with unfamiliar inputs. When standard categories fail to accommodate observed characteristics, the result is not immediate resolution, but a pause in classification that leaves the material positioned between known definitions. Within such analytical thresholds, the focus often shifts from identification to documentation of inconsistency, where the inability to categorize becomes itself a recorded outcome. In technical environments, this is not unusual when dealing with incomplete, damaged, or unusual samples, though the significance of such moments depends heavily on the broader context in which they occur. The presence of unresolved classification does not conclude the process, but rather marks a point at which further evaluation or additional comparative data may be required. As examination continues within controlled environments, the material becomes increasingly defined by the parameters of the system observing it, rather than by its original context of recovery. Over time, this shift gradually detaches the object from its point of origin in the narrative, embedding it instead within procedural frameworks that prioritize analysis over origin. In this way, the material's identity becomes shaped not only by what it is, but by how it is being studied and categorized within institutional systems. What emerges from this phase is a layered process in which physical evidence is gradually absorbed into structured evaluation systems, where its properties are interpreted through established scientific and technical frameworks. Each stage of assessment contributes to a narrowing field of interpretation, even when definitive classification remains incomplete. The importance of this phase lies not in final conclusions, but in the structured attempt to bring unfamiliar material into alignment with known systems of understanding. The progression of analysis within controlled environments set the stage for broader questions about whether additional recovery is extended beyond the initial known site. additional recovery zones, and expanding debris fields. What begins to surface in later interpretations is not a continuation of the original site narrative, but an expanding consideration of how the incident may have extended beyond a single definable point. At this stage of the story's evolution, attention is no longer anchored strictly to the initial location where debris was first reported, but instead begins to shift toward how fragments of information, physical, reported, and reconstructed, could relate to a broader spatial footprint. This shift does not introduce a new event, but rather reframes the existing one, opening the possibility that what was initially treated as a localized recovery may have had a wider distribution than earlier accounts suggested. Certain retrospective accounts introduce the possibility that the recovered materials were not confined to a single recovery location, though this suggestion remains inconsistently supported across available documentation. Rather than emerging from a single consolidated source, these indications appear scattered across different references, each contributing partial and sometimes indirect suggestions that additional material traces may have been encountered elsewhere. The uncertainty lies not in the existence of these references, but in their inability to form a continuous and verifiable chain that would clearly define a second or third location. Some descriptions associated with the event imply more than one point of contact with debris-like material, though these references appear fragmented rather than forming a coherent geographic pattern. In certain interpretations, these points are treated as possible extensions of a single event, while in others they are viewed as separate and unrelated instances that happen to share similar descriptive qualities. The lack of consistent alignment between these accounts prevents them from resolving into a unified secondary site, leaving them instead as isolated indicators that resist easy integration into a single map of events. The assumption of a singular, contained incident begins to weaken when viewed alongside accounts that distribute similar observations across different points of reference. This does not necessarily redefine the event, but it introduces structural tension into how it is understood, particularly when earlier interpretations rely heavily on a centralized point of origin. When multiple spatial references are considered simultaneously, the simplicity of a single location explanation becomes more difficult to maintain without qualification, as each additional reference adds complexity to what was previously understood as a contained occurrence. No consolidated record definitively confirms the presence of multiple recovery zones, yet the absence of a unified denial leaves the question structurally unresolved in archival interpretation. This creates a situation where the narrative is shaped as much by what is not explicitly stated as by what is recorded, resulting in a space of ambiguity that persists across different levels of analysis. In such cases, the absence of definitive clarification does not eliminate the question, but instead allows it to remain open within the boundaries of available documentation. Comparative review of overlapping references does not resolve into a clearer map of events, but instead increases the number of interpretive directions without convergence. Each additional reference point introduces a new possibility for spatial extension, but none provide the necessary continuity to establish a confirmed secondary recovery zone. As a result, the interpretive landscape becomes more complex rather than more defined, with each layer of information expanding the range of potential explanations without narrowing them toward a single outcome. Taken together, these layered references gradually erode the simplicity of a single location explanation, replacing it with a more fragmented spatial understanding that resists final definition. The effect is not the establishment of a new model, but the weakening of certainty around the original one, as each additional reference introduces variation without resolution. In this state, the incident is no longer confined to a singular geographic anchor in interpretation, but exists instead as a set of overlapping possibilities that cannot be fully aligned into one consistent spatial narrative. The presence of these competing interpretations does not confirm the existence of multiple recovery zones, but it does demonstrate how quickly spatial assumptions can become unstable when filtered through incomplete or fragmented records. What begins as a clearly defined location gradually becomes less fixed, as additional references are considered, even when those references do not fully agree with one another. This gradual expansion of interpretive space reflects not a conclusion, but a shift in how the incident is being reconstructed through limited and indirect evidence. As the number of possible spatial references increases, the clarity of the original location-based narrative begins to diminish, replaced by a more diffuse understanding of where and how related material may have been encountered. This diffusion does not replace the original account, but it sits alongside it, creating a layered structure in which certainty and uncertainty coexist without fully resolving each other. The result is a narrative that becomes less about pinpointing a single origin, and more about managing the tension between multiple, partially supported spatial possibilities. This widening uncertainty around physical locations would later influence how competing explanations attempted to reconstruct the origins of what was recovered. Conflicting explanations, Project Mogul, and the redefinition of evidence. Once the discussion of multiple possible recovery zones begins to lose structural prominence, interpretive focus gradually shifts toward explanatory frameworks designed to consolidate earlier inconsistencies into a unified narrative. At this stage, the incident is no longer being expanded geographically or materially, but instead is being reorganized through retrospective models that attempt to reduce fragmentation in the record. The emphasis changes from mapping uncertainty to resolving it, even if the resolution depends on reconstructing the past through systems of knowledge that were formalized after the original event had already entered public awareness. Later official reinterpretations frequently point to Project Mogul as a structured atmospheric research initiative operating through high-altitude balloon deployments during the same general historical period. This program, associated with mid-20th century scientific and military interest in upper atmosphere monitoring, is presented in later explanations as a plausible source for certain types of recovered materials. In this framing, what was initially described in ambiguous or unusual terms is repositioned within the context of experimental instrumentation designed for data collection at extreme altitudes, where physical components could be mistaken for unfamiliar debris when recovered, outside their operational environment. This framework reorganizes previously described debris-like material into categories consistent with experimental equipment components, rather than unidentified or anomalous objects. Items that were once described through uncertain or irregular physical characteristics are reinterpreted as fragments of balloon structures, radar reflectors, or supporting materials used in atmospheric research operations. The significance of this reinterpretation lies not only in the classification itself, but in how it redefines the meaning of observation, shifting attention away from perceived anomalies and toward functional explanations grounded in known experimental design. Earlier accounts emphasizing unusual physical behavior of recovered fragments stand in tension with the procedural interpretation that reframes those same observations through known research instrumentation. Descriptions that highlighted inconsistencies in material behavior, flexibility, or structural unfamiliarity do not disappear under this model, but are instead reassessed through the assumption that environmental degradation, handling conditions, or post-recovery damage could account for perceived irregularities. This creates a structural divide between experiential accounts and retrospective classification, where the same evidence supports different interpretive outcomes depending on the framework applied. Points of partial correspondence are identified when comparing documented characteristics with known Mogul-related equipment configurations, though several described anomalies remain difficult to fully reconcile. While certain structural elements and material types align broadly with components used in high-altitude research systems, not every reported characteristic finds a direct or unambiguous counterpart within the reconstructed explanation. This uneven alignment does not necessarily invalidate the framework, but it introduces areas where interpretation depends on inference rather than direct equivalence. The explanatory process itself transforms the meaning of evidence by prioritizing classification against known experimental systems rather than treating initial observations as standalone anomalies. In doing so, the focus shifts from the uniqueness of reported phenomena to their compatibility with established technological contexts. This methodological shift is important because it determines how uncertainty is resolved, not by expanding the category of the unknown, but by narrowing interpretation toward existing scientific and operational models. The considerable time gap between the original event and the formalization of this explanatory model introduces interpretive distance that affects how earlier descriptions are reconstructed. Over time, accounts of the incident pass through multiple layers of retelling, documentation, and institutional review, each of which contributes to how the event is later understood. This temporal separation does not simply delay explanation, it actively shapes it, allowing later frameworks to reinterpret earlier observations through knowledge systems that were not necessarily available at the time of the original reports. Even under structured reclassification, certain elements reported in earlier descriptions continue to resist full integration into the balloon-based experimental framework. These residual inconsistencies are not always presented as contradictions, but rather as areas where the available correspondence between description and known components remains incomplete. In such cases, the explanatory model provides a broad structural fit without necessarily accounting for every detail recorded in earlier accounts, leaving a margin where interpretation remains open. As competing frameworks attempt to stabilize the meaning of recovered evidence, the tension between retrospective explanation and original description becomes more apparent. The same set of reported observations can be understood differently depending on whether priority is given to initial testimony or later institutional classification, and this duality becomes central to how the incident is framed in historical context. The result is not a single resolved narrative, but a layered structure in which explanation and observation exist in parallel rather than complete alignment. Unresolved elements that persist across competing interpretations begin to draw attention toward reports that extend beyond material evidence into accounts involving biological recoveries. Reports of bodies among the recovered. With earlier explanatory models settling into broader acceptance of material-based interpretations, subsequent narratives begin introducing a separate layer of claims that extends beyond non-living evidence. At this stage, the focus of discussion subtly shifts away from debris classification and structural analysis and toward accounts that appear in later testimonies rather than in the immediate documentation of the incident itself. This transition does not emerge as a single defined moment, but rather as a gradual expansion in the scope of what is being described, where additional categories of reported observations begin to surface in retrospective accounts. Certain retrospective accounts introduce references that diverge from debris-focused descriptions, instead framing additional reported observations in biological or organism-related terms. These references do not originate from a single unified source, but appear across later narratives in varying contexts, often separated by time, interpretation, and level of detail. What distinguishes these accounts is not a consistent description, but the repeated introduction of a different category of claim, one that no longer fits comfortably within the framework of mechanical or material recovery. The appearance of such descriptions signals a distinct change in evidentiary category, where interpretation moves away from structural materials toward claims associated with living systems. In earlier phases of the incident's narrative, recovered material was discussed in terms of composition, behavior, and origin, all of which remained within the boundaries of physical analysis. However, in these later accounts, the language used begins to shift, introducing terminology that implies a fundamentally different kind of recovery, one that cannot be fully explained through conventional material classification alone. These references do not present themselves as a continuous record, but appear intermittently across later narratives with variations in emphasis, timing, and contextual framing. Some accounts focus on brief mentions embedded within broader recollections, while others present more detailed descriptions that attempt to situate these claims within a larger sequence of events. The lack of consistency does not eliminate the references, but it does prevent them from forming a single coherent narrative that can be uniformly interpreted or verified against a unified record. No unified or consistently verified official documentation establishes a complete sequence for these biological claims, yet their persistence in later discussions ensures they remain part of the broader narrative discourse. This creates a tension between absence and recurrence, where the lack of formal acknowledgement does not fully erase the references from later interpretations. Instead, they persist as fragmented elements within a wider body of retrospective discussion, existing in a space where they are neither fully integrated nor entirely excluded. The inclusion of such accounts expands the conceptual boundaries of the incident, introducing interpretive challenges that extend beyond the scope of material classification or physical analysis. Once the narrative incorporates claims that move beyond debris and structural evidence, the framework used to interpret the event becomes less stable, as it now must account for categories that do not align with the original observational context. This shift does not confirm or deny the validity of such claims, but it does alter the structure through which the incident is being understood in later accounts. At the point where descriptions shift into biological implication, the limits of verification become more pronounced, as the available information no longer corresponds to measurable or consistently documented physical evidence. Unlike material findings, which can be assessed through comparison, testing, and structural evaluation, these later references exist primarily within testimonial or secondary narrative forms. This introduces a separation between what can be analysed directly and what is being reported through recollection, interpretation, or reconstruction of earlier events. As this category of claims emerges, it does not replace earlier material-based accounts, but instead exists alongside them, creating parallel layers of interpretation that do not fully converge. The result is not a single, unified explanation, but a layered narrative structure in which different types of claims occupy different evidentiary spaces. Some remain grounded in physical recovery, while others exist entirely within the realm of later reporting, with no direct overlap that would allow them to be seamlessly reconciled. Later witness accounts begin introducing references to recovered forms that are described in biological terms rather than as debris. These accounts do not provide a consistent or verifiable sequence of events, but they do mark a shift in the type of information being associated with the recovery. Instead of focusing solely on fragments of material or structural components, these later narratives introduce a fundamentally different category of observation, one that alters the interpretive direction of the entire incident. What emerges from this phase is not a conclusion, but a widening of a narrative scope that complicates any attempt to define the recovery in purely material terms. The incident, once framed through physical evidence and controlled analysis, now carries additional layers of testimony that introduce questions extending beyond structural interpretation alone. Attention gradually shifted toward the question of which authorities assumed control over the recovery once initial reports began to circulate. Securing the scene, who took control of the recovery? Diminishing clarity in publicly available information directs attention toward the nature of official documentation produced during the handling of the recovery. At this point in the broader narrative, the focus is no longer on physical evidence or its interpretation, but on the systems through which information about the incident is recorded, filtered, and preserved. The shift is subtle but important. Instead of asking what was found or how it was classified, attention turns toward what was formally recorded, what was summarized, and what may have been excluded from the accessible record. In this sense, documentation itself becomes part of the event structure, shaping how later understanding is constructed. Emerging references to biological implications in later narratives reposition the focus of discussion toward how authority over the recovery environment was established and maintained. At this stage of the broader account, attention is no longer primarily directed at what was recovered or how it was described, but instead begins to concentrate on the conditions under which access to the area itself was regulated. This shift marks a transition from evidentiary interpretation to structural control, where the presence of authority becomes a central feature of the unfolding situation rather than a background condition. The narrative implication is that control mechanisms were not merely reactive, but foundational in shaping how information and access would be managed from the earliest phases onward. Immediate responses described in retrospective accounts involve the rapid establishment of controlled perimeters surrounding the area associated with initial reports. These descriptions, drawn from later reconstructions rather than a single continuous record, consistently emphasize speed and coordination in limiting access to the site. The formation of restricted boundaries is presented as one of the earliest observable indicators that the situation had moved beyond a localized incident, suggesting that containment procedures were implemented as a priority response to emerging information. In practical terms, this type of response would typically involve establishing defined zones of restricted entry, monitoring movement across those boundaries, and ensuring that only authorized personnel could interact with the affected area. Restricted entry points and controlled movement appear in later interpretations as defining operational conditions applied to the affected location. Movement in and out of the area is frequently described as being subject to immediate limitation, with access determined by authorization rather than proximity or circumstance. In this framing, the physical space of the incident is no longer open to incidental observation, but instead becomes segmented into controlled zones where visibility and access are selectively managed. The significance of this shift lies not only in restriction itself, but in how quickly the environment transitions from open terrain to a structured, regulated space. Sequential handling of any recovered elements is described through layered responsibility structures rather than through a single identifiable point of control. Rather than a linear chain managed by one clearly defined authority, later accounts suggest a system in which custody is distributed across multiple stages of handling, each associated with different levels of responsibility. This layered structure introduces complexity into how control is understood, as no single point appears to account for the entire process from recovery to transfer. Instead, responsibility is described in segments, with each phase governed by procedural rules that determine how material or information is passed along within institutional frameworks. Distribution of oversight responsibilities across multiple organizational levels is implied in several accounts, suggesting a non-centralized control structure. Instead of a singular authority managing all aspects of the situation, the narrative points toward overlapping jurisdictions that operate in coordination without being fully consolidated into one visible chain of command. This arrangement contributes to the broader ambiguity surrounding how decisions were made and how access was regulated during the critical early phases of the recovery process. The result is a structure that appears organized yet difficult to trace in a single linear pathway, especially when viewed through fragmented later accounts. Reduction in externally observable activity coincides with increased consolidation of control within the restricted area, limiting outside informational access. As control becomes more structured, the amount of detail available to outside observers diminishes, creating a narrowing field of visibility around ongoing operations. This contraction of observable information does not occur abruptly, but develops gradually as access becomes more tightly regulated and direct observation is replaced by indirect reporting. Over time, this shift contributes to a growing gap between what is assumed to have occurred and what can be independently verified through external sources. Divergence among external accounts becomes more pronounced as consistent first-hand visibility of the situation decreases. In the absence of continuous access, later narratives begin to vary in detail, emphasis, and interpretation, reflecting the fragmented nature of available information. These differences do not necessarily contradict one another in all cases, but they do prevent the formation of a single unified external account of how control was exercised during the period in question. Instead, multiple parallel interpretations emerge, each shaped by partial access, retrospective reconstruction, or secondary reporting. The increasing fragmentation of available accounts highlights how quickly an incident can transition from observable event to controlled narrative environment. Once access is limited and documentation becomes selective, the structure of understanding shifts away from direct observation and toward institutional interpretation. In such conditions, what is known about the event is no longer determined solely by what occurred, but also by how it was recorded and how that record was later made available or withheld. As attention continues to move through these layers of control and documentation, the broader question that emerges is not limited to what was recovered or how it was contained, but how the record of the event itself was constructed under conditions of restricted visibility. The paper trail that should exist but doesn't. Standard record-keeping procedures governing mid-century recovery operations typically establish a continuous administrative trail that links initial collection to final disposition through formal documentation. In structured operational environments, this kind of documentation is not treated as optional detail, but as an embedded requirement of process integrity, ensuring that every stage of handling can, in principle, be traced through written logs. The expectation is not just that actions occur, but that they are recorded in a way that allows later reconstruction of sequence, responsibility, and transfer. In incidents involving secured material, this baseline becomes even more pronounced, since controlled items normally require additional layers of verification beyond ordinary administrative entry. Operational frameworks used in military environments of the period generally require sequential logging of recovered materials, including movement records, custody transfers, and inventory validation at each stage. These logs are typically structured so that each transition point produces its own entry, creating a chain that connects origin, handling, and final placement without relying on memory or informal reporting. Even when information is restricted, The internal logic of the system still depends on documentation existing somewhere within the organizational structure. This is what makes the expectation of a continuous paper trail so central when later accounts refer to coordinated recovery and transfer activity. Documented practices for controlled material handling normally produce multiple intersecting records that allow later reconstruction of events, even when direct observation is no longer possible. In practical terms, this means that transport, storage, and analysis each generate their own documentation streams, which can be cross-referenced to verify consistency across departments or facilities. The system is designed so that even if one record is incomplete, others can compensate, preserving an auditable structure of events. This redundancy is what makes gaps in continuity particularly notable when they appear across multiple stages rather than within a single isolated segment. Expected continuity between recovery activity and administrative documentation becomes difficult to trace when referenced actions are not consistently reflected in surviving or accessible record sets. In later examinations of the incident, descriptions of movement, custody changes, and controlled handling appear across narrative accounts. Yet the corresponding administrative sequence is not uniformly visible in public archives. This creates a situation where operational activity is implied through description, but the formal documentation that would ordinarily confirm those actions is not readily assembled into a coherent chain. The effect is not the absence of isolated records, but the absence of a unified structure connecting them. References to movement and handling occasionally appear in narrative form, yet corresponding administrative entries that would ordinarily anchor those movements in formal documentation remain inconsistently identifiable. This divergence between narrative continuity and archival continuity becomes more pronounced when examining how multiple stages of the incident are described across different sources. One layer of accounts suggests coordinated transfers and structured handling, while the documentary layer accessible in public domains does not consistently reflect the same level of procedural detail. The result is a split between what is described and what can be traced through formal record systems. Record availability in institutional systems of the period is influenced by classification protocols that can limit access, redistribute documentation into restricted categories, or separate records from general archival visibility. Within such systems, documentation may still exist while remaining inaccessible to standard review processes, meaning absence in public archives does not necessarily equate to absence within institutional repositories. However, the existence of classification mechanisms also introduces variability in what is visible, what is summarized, and what is withheld from broader circulation. This variability becomes a key factor when attempting to understand why certain expected records are not easily located. The resulting disparity between expected documentation structures and available records introduces a persistent interpretive limitation, where procedural assumptions cannot be fully matched to accessible archival evidence. In this context, the absence is not treated as a single missing element, but as a broader discontinuity between how such operations are expected to be recorded and how they are later encountered in available sources. This gap does not resolve itself through additional interpretation of the same materials, but instead persists as a structural feature of the historical record surrounding the incident. The absence of a continuous administrative record naturally redirects attention toward how classification decisions shape the handling of information tied to the recovery. Cold War secrecy and the decision to classify the recovery. Security frameworks operating in the immediate post-war period routinely incorporate emerging categories of information into restricted handling protocols when initial assessment fails to establish clear classification. In the context of mid-20th century defense organization, classification is not a reaction reserved only for confirmed threats or identified foreign systems, but also a procedural response to ambiguity itself. When information cannot be immediately placed within existing categories, the system does not pause indefinitely for resolution. Instead, it applies provisional restriction to prevent premature dissemination. This mechanism reflects a broader institutional priority, limiting exposure to uncertain material until its strategic relevance can be determined through controlled channels. In practice, this means that the act of classification can occur before full understanding exists, shaping how information is stored, accessed, and later interpreted. Post-1947 strategic conditions within national defense structures introduce heightened sensitivity toward unidentified aerial phenomena and ambiguous material recoveries in proximity to military installations. The end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War period mark a transition in how information is evaluated, particularly when it intersects with airspace security and technological uncertainty. During this time, even routine anomalies in observational recovery could be interpreted through a security lens shaped by emerging geopolitical tensions. The result is an environment where the threshold for caution is significantly lowered, and where unexplained occurrences are more readily treated as matters requiring restricted evaluation. This broader climate does not need to confirm origin or intent to trigger protective administrative responses. Uncertainty alone becomes sufficient justification for control. Classification procedures of the era function through structured escalation processes that allow information to be restricted based on perceived sensitivity rather than confirmed identification. This means that full understanding of a subject is not a prerequisite for limiting access to it. Instead, preliminary assessments, often based on context, location, or potential implications, can trigger immediate protective measures within administrative systems. Once initiated, these measures can compartmentalize information, ensuring that only designated personnel or units have visibility into specific details, while broader dissemination is halted or redirected. Over time, these procedural safeguards create layers of separation between raw observation and publicly accessible explanation, even when the underlying subject remains unchanged. Operational uncertainty within intelligence and defense systems often triggers precautionary containment of information streams that cannot be immediately validated or categorized. In such cases, uncertainty is not treated as neutral. It is treated as a condition requiring management. When information resists immediate classification, it is often held in controlled environments where access is limited while further evaluation is conducted. This approach reflects a structural preference for containment over exposure when dealing with unknown variables in potentially high-impact contexts. The emphasis is not on resolving uncertainty quickly, but on ensuring that uncertainty does not circulate freely within systems that depend on clarity for operational stability. Information handling practices across multiple agencies frequently rely on compartmentalized distribution models that separate data access into isolated operational channels. Rather than maintaining a single unified record accessible across all levels, information is divided into segments based on function, clearance, and operational need. This structure limits cross-visibility between departments, ensuring that no single point of access necessarily contains the full scope of available information. While this system enhances control and security, it also introduces fragmentation, where understanding of a complete event depends on the ability to reconcile multiple partial perspectives. In cases involving sensitive material, this fragmentation can persist even after the immediate operational phase has concluded. Differences between publicly released explanations and internal handling practices commonly arise when classification protocols prevent alignment between external communication and internal documentation systems. Public narratives are typically constructed within constraints that prioritize clarity, security, and consistency with authorized disclosures, while internal systems may contain additional layers of detail that are not available for general dissemination. This divergence does not necessarily indicate contradiction, but rather reflects the operation of parallel information environments governed by different access rules and communication requirements. Over time, these parallel systems can produce accounts that appear misaligned simply because they originate from different levels of informational access rather than from a single unified source. Long-term effects of classification systems include progressive reduction of accessible detail, not through single acts of removal, but through cumulative restriction over time. As information is reclassified, compartmentalized, or retained within restricted archives, the publicly visible record may gradually become less comprehensive, even if underlying documentation continues to exist within controlled systems. This creates a condition in which the passage of time does not necessarily expand public understanding, but can instead stabilize existing limitations in what can be independently verified or reconstructed. The result is a historical record that may appear complete in structure, but incomplete in accessibility, depending on the level of clearance applied to its underlying components. Within this framework, classification is not merely an administrative action, applied after events occur, but an ongoing process that shapes how those events are later understood. Once applied, it influences not only who can access information, but also how that information is assembled, interpreted, and communicated across institutional boundaries. In this sense, classification becomes part of the event's extended life cycle, affecting its visibility long after the initial circumstances have passed. The logic of classification ultimately redirects inquiry toward the nature of the material that prompted such restrictive handling in the first place. The technology, question, what was being examined? Mid-20th century scientific capability in aeronautics and materials research operates within clearly defined engineering limits that shape how unfamiliar physical behavior is evaluated. At the time, scientific interpretation of physical phenomena is grounded in measurable performance, repeatable experimentation, and comparison against established theoretical frameworks that have already been tested in controlled environments. This means that any claim involving unusual material behavior is not assessed in isolation, but against a structured baseline of what known physics and engineering can reliably produce under similar conditions. In such a system, the boundary between unusual and incompatible is not immediate, but developed through systematic comparison and elimination of conventional explanations. The process is deliberately cautious, because premature classification of a phenomenon can distort later analysis if initial assumptions prove incorrect. Engineering systems developed during the 1940s rely on known aerodynamic principles, metallurgical standards, and measurable physical responses that establish reference points for interpreting unusual observations. Aircraft design, propulsion research, and structural metallurgy all depend on predictable relationships between force, heat, stress, and material deformation. Even experimental wartime technologies remain anchored to these measurable constraints, where performance improvements are achieved through refinement rather than fundamental deviation from known physics. Within this framework, anything that does not conform to expected performance is not automatically categorized as extraordinary, but instead placed under extended review or comparative testing. The assumption is not that unknown behavior implies unknown origin, but that unknown behavior requires deeper measurement. Descriptions attributed to recovered material in later narratives are often evaluated through comparison with established material science behaviors known from contemporaneous laboratory research. These descriptions typically reference characteristics such as unusual weight distribution, atypical response to mechanical force, or behavior that appears inconsistent with conventional alloy properties. In scientific practice, such claims would ordinarily be subjected to replication attempts, controlled stress testing, and compositional analysis to determine whether observed effects are reproducible under standardized conditions. The critical distinction in this phase of evaluation lies between observation under uncontrolled conditions and verified behavior under laboratory replication. Without controlled repetition, even striking observations remain scientifically provisional rather than confirmed. Scientific assessment practices of the period typically require reproducibility and controlled observation before any anomalous material characteristic can be formally incorporated into accepted findings. This requirement is not merely procedural, but foundational, ensuring that scientific knowledge is built on results that can be independently verified rather than isolated reports. In practical terms, this means that multiple teams operating under similar conditions must be able to produce comparable results before a property is recognized as part of established understanding. If a phenomenon cannot be reproduced, it remains outside formal classification regardless of how consistently it is described in initial observations. This creates a deliberate separation between early observation and accepted scientific fact. Specialized scientific fields of the era, while advanced within their respective domains, remain functionally separated, limiting cross-disciplinary synthesis when evaluating unfamiliar phenomena. Metallurgy focuses on composition and structural behavior, physics on fundamental forces and energy interactions, and aeronautics on performance under atmospheric conditions. When a subject does not align cleanly with one discipline, interpretation can become distributed across multiple fields without a single unified framework emerging. This separation is not a weakness, but a design feature of scientific organization at the time intended to maintain precision within each domain. However, when a subject appears to fall between categories, this same structure can slow the formation of a coherent explanation. claims involving unusual material responses become particularly significant when they cannot be independently reproduced under controlled experimental conditions using available technology. In such cases, the inability to replicate observed behavior does not immediately discredit the observation, but it does limit its integration into formal scientific models. Instead, these cases often remain in a category of unresolved anomalies, subject to continued review or re-examination as new methods or instruments become available. Historical scientific practice shows that some anomalies are eventually resolved through improved instrumentation, while others fade from active study due to lack of verifiable continuity. The key distinction is whether new evidence can bring the phenomenon back into reproducible range. A widening separation between observed claims and reproducible scientific validation introduces a persistent uncertainty that cannot be resolved through description alone, but only through controlled verification processes that may not have been fully accessible at the time. This separation becomes particularly relevant when accounts describe properties that sit at the edge of known physical behavior, where small variations in measurement or interpretation can produce significantly different conclusions. In such contexts, uncertainty is not simply a gap in knowledge, but a structural condition created by the limits of available instrumentation, methodological constraints, and the absence of repeatable experimental access to the original conditions of observation. Over time, this condition tends to preserve ambiguity rather than eliminate it, especially when direct re-examination of the original material is not consistently possible. In addition to measurement constraints, technological limitations of the period also define how far investigative interpretation can proceed before encountering analytical ceilings. Instrument sensitivity, data resolution, and material testing precision all influence how confidently results can be interpreted, particularly when dealing with phenomena that do not match expected patterns. Even when anomalies are detected, the ability to characterize them fully depends on whether existing tools can isolate, measure, and reproduce the observed effects with sufficient accuracy. If they cannot, the phenomenon remains partially described but not fully understood within the scientific framework of the time. The limits of contemporary technical understanding naturally shift attention toward the specialists who would have been brought in to assess material behavior beyond the limits of standard 1940s analysis. Quiet consultations, who was brought in to study it, analytical boundaries previously defined through measurable scientific limitation, gradually redirect focus away from the material itself and toward the controlled environments where evaluation would have taken place under restricted conditions. In most technical investigations of unfamiliar phenomena, the point at which standard analysis reaches its limits does not conclude the inquiry, but instead shifts it into structured consultation pathways designed to extend interpretation without expanding access to sensitive context. This transition is not abrupt, but procedural, shaped by how organizations manage uncertainty when direct explanation is not immediately available within existing scientific frameworks. The emphasis moves away from what is being observed and toward how observation itself is being coordinated across different layers of expertise, each operating within defined informational boundaries. Technical investigation rarely remains confined to a single discipline once initial assessments encounter limitations, often leading to carefully managed consultation channels that allow selective external input without revealing full operational context. In such systems, additional expertise is not introduced broadly, but incrementally, based on narrowly defined needs that emerge from earlier stages of analysis. This means that rather than assembling a complete multidisciplinary team with full access to all available information, organizations tend to distribute fragments of the problem to specific specialists whose expertise aligns with isolated aspects of the observed behavior. The structure ensures that knowledge is expanded laterally without necessarily becoming fully integrated at any single point of review. Specialists introduced into sensitive evaluation frameworks are typically assigned narrowly defined roles, ensuring that their analysis is shaped by partial exposure rather than comprehensive understanding of the subject under examination. This approach reflects a broader methodological principle in controlled research environments, where limiting informational scope is considered essential for maintaining procedural security and analytical focus. In practical terms, it means that an expert may be asked to evaluate material composition without knowledge of its origin, or to assess structural behavior without access to comparative context. The resulting analysis remains scientifically valid within its scope, but deliberately incomplete in its interpretive reach. Expert involvement in classified or restricted research environments is generally determined through institutional networks that prioritize specialization and reliability over any direct awareness of the broader investigative framework. Selection processes typically draw from established scientific communities, research institutions, and technical industries where expertise can be verified through prior work rather than direct exposure to the subject matter under review. This creates a system in which participation is based on capability rather than full situational awareness, allowing complex technical problems to be distributed across multiple qualified individuals without requiring any single participant to understand the entire operational picture. Scientific inquiry operating under unrestricted conditions differs fundamentally from environments where data access, replication capability, and contextual transparency are selectively constrained by operational requirements. In open research settings, findings are expected to be reproducible, shared, and independently verified, allowing conclusions to be tested across multiple institutions. In contrast, restricted evaluation environments introduce controlled boundaries around what can be observed, recorded, or distributed beyond the immediate analytical team. These boundaries do not necessarily alter the scientific methods being applied, but they do influence how results are interpreted, particularly when replication outside the controlled setting is not feasible. Different layers of technical assessment frequently proceed in parallel without convergence, resulting in situations where multiple experts evaluate separate fragments of the same phenomenon without shared visibility of the complete dataset. This fragmentation of analysis is not uncommon in complex investigative systems, particularly when security constraints or compartmentalization protocols limit cross-communication between specialized teams. Each contributor may generate internally consistent conclusions based on their assigned segment, yet the absence of integrated oversight prevents the formation of a single, unified interpretation. Over time, this can produce parallel analytical tracks that remain valid within their own boundaries, but disconnected from one another in broader synthesis. Restricted handling protocols for sensitive material often require evaluation to take place within controlled facilities designed to limit environmental variability while maintaining strict oversight of experimental conditions. These environments are structured to ensure that observations are not influenced by external factors that could compromise measurement accuracy or procedural integrity. While such conditions are standard in high-precision scientific work, their application in sensitive contexts also serves to regulate access and maintain separation between different stages of analysis. The result is an environment where observation is highly controlled, but also inherently contained within specific operational limits. Documentation systems operating under compartmentalized structures commonly emphasize procedural classification over individual attribution, producing records that describe outcomes without fully identifying all contributing participants. This reflects a broader organizational principle in which the continuity of process is prioritized over personal recognition within sensitive or restricted domains. As a result, technical reports may preserve detailed descriptions of analytical findings while omitting or generalizing the identities of those involved in producing them. Over time, this creates archival records that are precise in content but limited in visible authorship, reinforcing the separation between knowledge production and individual attribution. Increasing consolidation of interpretive authority eventually redirected focus away from those conducting the analysis, and toward the mechanisms determining how their findings were formally understood and controlled. The emergence of the CIA and control over unusual intelligence. Layered consultation structures described earlier begin to recede in focus, as attention expands outward toward the institutional systems responsible for organizing, directing, and supervising those very processes of analysis. What had previously been examined through the lens of controlled scientific input and compartmentalized expertise now becomes part of a broader structural question concerning how information itself is managed once it enters national security channels. In this wider frame, the emphasis shifts away from individual analytical efforts and toward the architecture that determines how those efforts are coordinated, restricted, and interpreted across multiple institutional layers. The significance of any single evaluation becomes increasingly dependent not only on what is discovered, but on how that discovery is positioned within a developing system of centralized intelligence oversight. Post-war restructuring of intelligence operations in the United States culminated in the formal establishment of a centralized agency in 1947. designed to coordinate information gathering across multiple, previously separate channels. This development emerged from the recognition that wartime intelligence systems, while effective in operational contexts, lacked a unified peacetime structure capable of integrating diplomatic, military, and technical streams of information into a single coherent framework. The creation of a centralized authority did not eliminate existing intelligence organizations, but instead placed coordination and synthesis under a shared administrative structure. In practical terms, this meant that intelligence no longer flowed in isolated channels, but could be reviewed, compared, and prioritized within a broader national security context that extended beyond individual departments. Centralization of intelligence functions introduced a structural distinction between the collection of information and the authority to determine how that information is interpreted and prioritized within national security frameworks. This separation is subtle but significant, because it allows multiple entities to continue gathering data while a centralized body determines which findings are elevated, cross-referenced, or subjected to further analysis. In such a system, the act of interpretation becomes an institutional function in its own right, distinct from the technical process of observation. The result is a layered hierarchy in which raw data, analytical assessment, and strategic interpretation may exist at different levels of access, each shaped by its position within the broader intelligence structure. Incoming intelligence assessments are routinely organized through classification systems that assign varying levels of significance and relevance to reports, including those that do not immediately conform to established explanatory models. These classification systems are not designed solely to conceal information, but to regulate its distribution based on sensitivity, reliability, and potential strategic impact. Reports that fall outside conventional categories are not necessarily excluded from analysis, but are often placed into broader investigative groupings that allow for continued review without immediate resolution. This approach ensures that anomalous or incomplete data remains within the system, while preventing premature conclusions from becoming embedded in formal assessments. Multiple overlapping jurisdictions across military and civilian intelligence bodies created an environment in which responsibility for interpretation could be distributed rather than unified under a single governing authority. Even after the establishment of centralized coordination structures, existing agencies retained specialized roles that contributed to a complex network of analytical responsibility. Military branches continued to evaluate technical and operational intelligence relevant to defense capabilities, while centralized agencies focused on synthesis and broader strategic assessment. This division of responsibility did not eliminate coordination, but it introduced a system in which different parts of the same informational landscape could be interpreted independently before being integrated at higher levels of review. Access to intelligence materials is structured through hierarchical classification tiers that regulate not only who may view specific information, but also how that information can be processed and shared across institutions. These tiers function as both protective and organizational mechanisms, ensuring that sensitive material is restricted to authorized personnel while maintaining controlled pathways for analysis and review. In practice, this means that two individuals working within the same broader system may operate with fundamentally different levels of informational awareness, depending on their clearance and institutional role. The structure is designed to preserve operational security, but it also naturally produces segmented understanding across the analytical community. Evolving strategic priorities gradually broaden the scope of what qualified as intelligence-relevant anomalies, incorporating a wider range of unexplained technical and observational reports into analytical consideration. This expansion did not require immediate identification of origin or mechanism, but rather recognition that certain categories of unresolved data could carry potential relevance to national security assessment. As a result, intelligence frameworks began to accommodate not only confirmed information, but also persistent uncertainties that resisted conventional classification. These anomalies were not treated as conclusions, but as active data points within ongoing analytical systems, subject to re-evaluation as new information or methodologies became available. Archival systems within intelligence frameworks preserve records across multiple compartmentalized channels, resulting in documentation structures that retain detail while limiting unified reconstruction of historical sequences. This method of record preservation ensures that sensitive information remains accessible within controlled boundaries while preventing unrestricted consolidation of all related materials into a single accessible narrative. Over time, this creates a system in which institutional memory is preserved in fragments distributed across different levels of classification and responsibility. The continuity of information is maintained, but its full reconstruction requires access across multiple compartments that are not always simultaneously available. Increasing institutional refinement of classification and coordination systems eventually shifted analytical attention toward how earlier unresolved recoveries were initially absorbed into the emerging intelligence structure. Early intelligence handling of unexplained recoveries, centralized authority outlined in earlier intelligence structures, takes on practical significance when viewed through the uncertain conditions under which unfamiliar recoveries were first encountered and processed. Systems that had only recently been organized for coordination and oversight were suddenly required to respond to material or events that did not clearly align with established categories of intelligence reporting. In such moments, structure exists, but certainty does not, and the gap between the two becomes the space where early handling practices begin to form. What emerges is not a fixed procedure, but a pattern of responses shaped by necessity, caution, and the limitations of available frameworks that had not yet been tested against this kind of ambiguity. Conventional intelligence frameworks rely on predefined classification systems, yet certain recovered materials can resist immediate alignment with any recognized category. These systems are designed to sort information efficiently, assigning reports to known domains such as foreign technology, atmospheric phenomena, or experimental development. When a recovery does not comfortably fit within these classifications, it is not immediately excluded, but instead placed into provisional categories that allow for continued observation without definitive labeling. This intermediate state reflects both the flexibility and the limits of structured intelligence analysis, where uncertainty is managed through temporary classification rather than resolved through immediate explanation. Early responses to unfamiliar incidents frequently develop through adaptive decision-making rather than established procedure, drawing from overlapping military, scientific, and intelligence practices. In the absence of a dedicated protocol, handling pathways are assembled from existing systems that are closest in function, even if they were not designed for that specific purpose. Military procedures may govern initial recovery and transport, scientific methods may guide preliminary evaluation, and intelligence frameworks may shape documentation and classification. These overlapping layers do not always integrate seamlessly, but they provide a functional structure through which the incident can be processed without halting operations entirely. The result is a hybrid approach that reflects the system's attempt to respond to unfamiliar conditions using familiar tools. Strict chain of custody protocols govern the transfer of sensitive materials, ensuring traceability while limiting exposure to authorized personnel only. These protocols are designed to preserve the integrity of the material by documenting each stage of movement, from initial recovery to subsequent analysis or storage. Every transfer is recorded, every handler is identified within the system, and access is restricted based on clearance levels and operational necessity. While such procedures are standard in handling classified or sensitive items, their application to unexplained recoveries introduces an additional layer of significance, as the origin and nature of the material may not yet be fully understood. The emphasis remains on control and accountability, even in the absence of complete knowledge. Immediate priorities in initial handling stages often emphasize containment and control before full technical analysis can be carried out. This approach reflects a broader operational principle in which potential risk is managed before interpretation is attempted. Containment ensures that any unknown properties, whether structural, chemical, or otherwise, are isolated within controlled environments, where they can be observed without external interference. This sequencing does not delay analysis unnecessarily, but rather establishes conditions under which analysis can proceed safely and systematically. In practice, it means that understanding the material becomes a secondary phase, following the establishment of secure handling conditions that prevent uncontrolled exposure. Structured reporting pathways organize incoming information into formal records that move upward through layers of review and interpretation. Each stage of reporting involves not only the transmission of data, but also its refinement, as raw observations are translated into standardized formats that align with existing intelligence documentation practices. Details may be summarized, technical language may be adjusted for broader accessibility within the system, and preliminary interpretations may be included or omitted depending on the level of certainty associated with the findings. As reports progress through these layers, the information they contain is shaped not only by the original observation, but by the interpretive framework of each reviewing level. Persistent analytical attention is commonly directed toward cases that do not yield clear conclusions, allowing them to remain active within evolving assessment systems. Rather than being dismissed, such cases are often retained as reference points for future comparison, particularly when new information or analytical methods become available. This ongoing attention does not guarantee resolution, but it ensures that the case remains accessible within the system's memory, capable of being revisited as part of a broader pattern of similar incidents. Over time, this creates a network of partially understood events that collectively inform how new recoveries are interpreted, even if each individual case remains unresolved in isolation. Patterns observed across multiple atypical incidents can gradually influence the formation of new, internal procedures for categorization and response. As intelligent systems encounter repeated instances of material or events that challenge existing classifications, adjustments are made to accommodate these anomalies within more structured frameworks. These adjustments may take the form of new reporting categories, revised handling protocols, or updated analytical guidelines that reflect lessons learned from earlier cases. The evolution is incremental, shaped by experience rather than prediction, and often formalized only after sufficient patterns have emerged to justify procedural change. Records shaped by these early handling methods increasingly present structured conclusions, while leaving the direct details of the recoveries themselves curiously absent. Declassified files that avoid the recovery itself. Handling practices established during early intelligence responses begin to leave their imprint within the records that survive declassification, where structured reporting preserves selected observations while leaving others noticeably absent. These records do not present themselves as incomplete in an obvious sense, nor do they openly suggest omission, yet their construction reflects decisions made long before their eventual release into the public domain. What appears on the page is shaped by classification protocols, review processes, and institutional priorities that determine not only what information can be shared, but how it is framed once it is made visible. In this way, declassified documents function less as direct windows into past events, and more as carefully filtered representations, offering clarity in some areas while maintaining silence in others that are not immediately explained. Numerous official records acknowledge the presence of unidentified aerial phenomena, often describing movement patterns and observational conditions without extending into detailed physical characterization. These acknowledgements typically include references to visual sightings, radar detections, or flight behaviors that do not align with known aircraft capabilities of the time. The emphasis remains on what was observed in the sky, speed, trajectory, maneuverability, rather than on any physical interaction with the object itself. This focus reflects the nature of many reports as observational accounts, yet it also establishes a consistent boundary in which aerial phenomena are documented without corresponding attention to any potential material recovery that may have followed. Carefully constructed terminology within these documents reflects a consistent preference for observational description over definitive classification or material identification. Terms such as unidentified, unknown origin, or no conventional explanation are applied with precision, indicating a deliberate effort to describe phenomena without extending beyond what can be verified within the available data. This language is not vague but controlled, ensuring that the report remains grounded in measurable observation while avoiding speculative interpretation. The result is a body of documentation that conveys uncertainty in a structured manner, where ambiguity is acknowledged but contained within defined linguistic boundaries. Descriptions contained in declassified reports frequently emphasize what was seen or tracked, while remaining notably silent on the nature of any physical debris or recovered substance. Even in cases where observational detail is extensive, the transition from aerial phenomenon to physical interaction is rarely documented in the same record. This absence does not present itself as an explicit gap, but rather as a consistent feature across multiple documents, where the narrative concludes at the point of observation without extending into subsequent phases of investigation. Over time, this pattern becomes more apparent, not through isolated instances, but through repetition across a wide range of release materials. Institutional reporting systems are designed in a way that can separate different categories of information, allowing certain details to remain outside the scope of documents released for public review. This separation is not arbitrary, but structured, reflecting how intelligence systems organize data according to sensitivity, relevance, and classification level. Observational reports may be processed through one channel, while physical evidence, if it exists, may be documented within entirely different systems subject to stricter access controls. As a result, the absence of certain details in declassified files does not necessarily indicate that those details were never recorded, but rather that they may reside in segments of the record that remain inaccessible or were never included in the same reporting stream. Distinct reporting channels often handle aerial observations and material recoveries independently, creating parallel records that do not necessarily intersect within the same documentation stream. This separation ensures that different types of information can be analysed within their appropriate contexts, but it also prevents the formation of a single, unified account that traces an incident from initial sighting through to final analysis. In practical terms, this means that a documented observation may exist without an accompanying record of any physical follow-up, even if such follow-up occurred within a different part of the system. The structure preserves detail within each domain, yet limits cross-referencing between them in publicly accessible records. Review processes governing the release of classified material determine not only what becomes visible, but also what remains withheld or partially redacted within the official record. Declassification is not a process of full disclosure, but one of selective release, guided by criteria that consider national security, technological sensitivity, and the potential implications of revealing certain types of information. Sections of documents may be removed, summarized, or generalized to align with these criteria, resulting in records that appear complete in form while containing deliberate omissions in substance. The effect is subtle, often detectable only through comparison across multiple documents, where similar patterns of absence begin to emerge. A consistent pattern begins to emerge across released files, where acknowledgement of unexplained phenomena is preserved, while direct reference to physical recovery remains absent. This pattern does not rely on a single document or isolated case, but on the cumulative effect of multiple records that share similar structural characteristics. Each document contributes a fragment of the larger picture, yet none provide a comprehensive account that includes both observation and physical analysis within the same accessible narrative. The repetition of this structure suggests a systemic approach to documentation, one that maintains clarity in certain areas while sustaining distance from others that are left undefined. Where official records maintain this measured distance from the physical details of recovery, accounts from individual witnesses begin to introduce elements that the documents themselves never fully address. Testimonies that complicate the official record. Accounts from individuals begin to surface in contrast to the restrained nature of declassified records, introducing details that do not consistently align with what has been formally documented. These accounts do not emerge within structured reporting systems or follow standardized formats of analysis, yet they persist as a parallel layer of information that exists alongside official documentation. Unlike institutional records, which are shaped by classification protocols and procedural review, testimony is shaped by personal experience, perception, and recollection, making it both immediate and inherently variable. The presence of these accounts does not replace the official record, but it introduces an additional dimension in which interpretation becomes less about what is recorded, and more about how differing versions of the same event are understood in relation to one another. Various categories of observers have contributed statements over time, ranging from military personnel involved in operations to civilians who reported unusual activity in proximity to the incident. Each category brings a different perspective shaped by role, access, and proximity, influencing how events were perceived and later described. Military participants may describe procedural elements or controlled environments, while civilian observers often focus on visual impressions or immediate surroundings. These differing vantage points do not necessarily conflict in isolation, but when considered collectively, they introduce a range of perspectives that complicate attempts to construct a single, unified narrative. The variation reflects not only differences in observation, but also differences in context, responsibility, and exposure to subsequent interpretation. Certain statements describe elements that differ significantly from official explanations, presenting alternative descriptions of both the event and the materials reportedly involved. In some cases, these accounts challenge the characterization of the incident as a conventional occurrence, suggesting features that do not align with standard explanations provided in official summaries. Such contradictions do not automatically establish an alternative conclusion, but they do introduce tension between what is formally recorded and what is individually reported. The significance of this tension lies not in determining which account is correct, but in recognizing that the coexistence of conflicting descriptions prevents the formation of a single, uncontested interpretation. Differences between individual testimonies become apparent when accounts are compared, revealing inconsistencies in detail, sequence, and interpretation. Some descriptions emphasize specific characteristics, while others omit or alter those same elements, creating variations that cannot be easily reconciled through simple comparison. These inconsistencies do not necessarily invalidate the accounts, but they do complicate their integration into a coherent narrative. The absence of uniformity among testimonies reflects the subjective nature of observation and recall, where individual experiences are filtered through perception, context, and the conditions under which they are later recounted. As a result, testimony functions not as a singular source of clarity, but as a collection of perspectives that resist consolidation into a single, definitive account. Human recollection is subject to change over time, with memory influenced by the passage of years, external information, and the conditions under which events were originally experienced. Psychological research demonstrates that memory is not a static record but a dynamic process, where details can be reshaped, reinforced, or diminished through repeated recall or exposure to new interpretations. In cases where testimony is provided long after the event, the potential for altered recollection becomes a significant factor in evaluating the reliability of specific details. This does not render testimony unreliable in its entirety, but it introduces an additional layer of complexity in determining how closely current accounts reflect the original experience. Some individuals who initially provided statements later modified, withdrew, or declined to revisit their accounts, adding another layer of complexity to the overall narrative. Changes in testimony can occur for a variety of reasons, including personal reconsideration, external influence, or the evolving context in which the account is interpreted. The absence of consistent follow-up statements from the same individuals further complicates efforts to trace how accounts have developed over time. In certain cases, silence becomes as significant as speech, where the lack of continued engagement with the narrative leaves gaps that cannot be easily filled through available information. Ongoing attention to these accounts continues in part because official explanations have not addressed every detail raised within them. Where documentation provides structured but limited descriptions, testimony often introduces elements that extend beyond those boundaries, prompting further examination rather than closure. This dynamic sustains interest not because testimony resolves uncertainty, but because it maintains it, ensuring that questions remain open in the absence of complete alignment between different sources of information. The persistence of these accounts reflects the broader condition of incomplete understanding, where neither official records nor personal statements fully account for all reported aspects of the event. A persistent divide remains between structured documentation and personal testimony, with neither source fully resolving the discrepancies introduced by the other. Official records offer consistency and procedural clarity, while testimony provides detail and immediacy, yet the two do not converge into a unified explanation that satisfies all available information. This separation creates a sustained state of interpretive tension, where each source highlights limitations in the other without fully compensating for them. Over time, the coexistence of these parallel narratives reinforces the complexity of the subject, preserving uncertainty as an enduring feature rather than a temporary condition awaiting resolution. As these competing accounts resist alignment within a single explanation, focus turns toward whether any reported materials were ever examined with the intent of understanding or replicating their properties. The question of reverse engineering the recovered material. Conflicting testimony and inconsistent documentary traces collectively redirect analytical focus toward whether any structured attempt was ever made to reproduce the properties described in earlier accounts. This shift does not introduce new material evidence, but rather changes the frame of inquiry from observation and documentation toward process and intent. In technical and intelligence contexts, the act of reproduction is often treated as a critical step in understanding unfamiliar systems, particularly when direct explanation is not immediately available through conventional scientific comparison. The absence or presence of replication efforts becomes, in itself, a significant indicator of how seriously a phenomenon was treated within applied research environments, even when the underlying subject remains partially or entirely outside public verification. Technical investigation within engineering and materials science typically begins with systematic evaluation, aimed at determining whether observed properties can be reproduced under controlled conditions. This process is grounded in established scientific methodology, where replication serves as both a validation tool and a pathway toward functional understanding. When a material or system exhibits unusual behavior, researchers ordinarily attempt to isolate variables, define structural composition, and reconstruct conditions under which the observed properties can be consistently reproduced. Without this step, even detailed observations remain incomplete from an applied science perspective, as they describe behavior without establishing whether that behavior can exist independently of the original context in which it was observed. Established reverse engineering processes rely on sequential stages of breakdown, compositional analysis, and reconstructed modeling to approximate functional behavior of unknown systems. In practice, this often begins with non-destructive evaluation techniques designed to preserve the integrity of the original material while extracting measurable data. Advanced imaging, spectroscopic analysis, and controlled stress testing are typically employed to identify structural patterns and underlying composition. Once sufficient data is gathered, computational modeling may be used to simulate behavior under varying conditions, allowing researchers to test whether observed properties can be theoretically reproduced. These methods are widely used across aerospace, materials science, and advanced manufacturing research, particularly when dealing with unfamiliar or proprietary technologies. Reproduction of physical properties in scientific research depends fundamentally on access to sufficiently complete material data, enabling accurate reconstruction of underlying structure and behavior. Even minor gaps in available information can significantly alter the outcome of replication attempts, as material properties often depend on precise molecular arrangement, environmental history, and manufacturing conditions that may not be immediately observable. In cases where only partial samples exist, or where the original context of the material is unknown, replication becomes a process of approximation rather than exact reconstruction. This distinction is critical, as it separates confirmed replication from theoretical modeling, where results may be consistent in simulation but unverified in physical implementation. Restricted or partial access to physical samples can significantly constrain experimental reconstruction, even within highly advanced laboratory environments. Scientific facilities capable of conducting high-level materials analysis still rely on the integrity and completeness of input data to produce meaningful results. When access is limited, whether due to classification, preservation conditions, or chain of custody restrictions, the scope of possible analysis narrows accordingly. Researchers may be able to identify composition or structural characteristics, but without full material continuity, the ability to reproduce behavior remains incomplete. This creates a scenario in which understanding is asymmetrical, with analysis exceeding replication capability. Specialized research facilities designed for sensitive analysis operate under layered access controls that influence both the scope of experimentation and the visibility of internal procedures. These environments are structured to manage both scientific inquiry and information security simultaneously, ensuring that only authorized personnel can access specific stages of analysis. While this allows for controlled investigation of highly sensitive materials, it also introduces segmentation in how research is conducted and recorded. Different teams may be responsible for separate phases of evaluation, each operating within defined informational boundaries that limit cross-access to full experimental context. Publicly accessible declassified material contains no verified documentation confirming successful reproduction of the material properties described in earlier accounts. This absence does not, by itself, indicate whether such efforts were attempted, only that no outcomes of that nature are present within released records. In intelligence and research systems, unsuccessful or inconclusive results are often documented differently from successful replication, and in some cases may remain within restricted archives depending on classification status. As a result, the public record reflects what has been released rather than the full scope of internal activity that may have taken place. A structural divide persists between the intent to replicate anomalous material behaviour and the absence of documented outcomes within available scientific and intelligence records. This divide is not defined by contradiction, but by separation between process and disclosure. Engineering intent, where it exists, is typically directed toward understanding and potential reproduction. Yet the visibility of such efforts depends entirely on how results are recorded, classified, or distributed across institutional systems. In this sense, the absence of confirmation does not eliminate the possibility of study, but it does limit the ability to trace its outcomes through publicly accessible channels. Without any publicly documented replication results to reference, the focus turns to where such materials may have been physically stored or transferred after initial recovery, where the materials may have been stored. Control over recovered materials is not defined solely by analysis or classification, but also by the systems that determine how physical objects are routed, contained, and maintained after initial processing. In structured intelligence and defense environments, the movement of material is treated as a governed process in which logistics, documentation, and authorization operate together to regulate both access and visibility. What begins as a physical recovery does not remain a single isolated object within a single location, but instead becomes part of an administrative system where its status is continuously defined by handling protocols and classification boundaries. In this sense, storage is not a static endpoint but a continuation of controlled management that extends beyond the moment of initial evaluation. In intelligence and military frameworks, the concept of storage extends beyond physical placement and operates instead as part of a structured system of custody, classification, and access control. Materials of potential scientific or strategic interest are assigned handling procedures that define not only where they are kept, but how they may be accessed, reviewed, or transferred over time. These procedures ensure that access is limited to authorized personnel operating within specific roles, creating a layered system in which physical objects exist alongside parallel documentation structures. The result is a system where storage is inseparable from governance, and where location alone does not fully describe the status of a material. Material transferred through sensitive operations is typically tracked through sequential custody protocols designed to maintain accountability at every stage of movement and handling. Each transfer is recorded within formal systems that assign responsibility at every point of transition, ensuring that the chain of custody remains intact across different environments and operational contexts. However, the visibility of these records depends entirely on the classification level under which they are maintained, meaning that detailed movement logs may exist without being accessible in public-facing documentation. This creates a distinction between operational traceability and external transparency, where internal systems may preserve continuity that is not reflected in released records. Secure environments designated for restricted materials often function within broader institutional networks that include research, containment, and archival responsibilities. These facilities are not always centralized, but instead operate as part of distributed systems where different locations serve distinct roles within the overall management structure. Some environments are designed for immediate examination, others for long-term retention, and others for secure archival storage under strict access conditions. This distribution allows systems to manage sensitive materials without concentrating risk in a single location, but it also disperses physical continuity across multiple controlled points. Distribution of sensitive materials across multiple secured locations is a common practice in compartmentalized systems where centralized storage is intentionally avoided. By separating components of material handling across different facilities, systems reduce the risk of compromise while maintaining strict control over access at each stage. In such arrangements, no single location necessarily contains a complete record of a material's presence or history, as each facility only manages a portion of the overall custody structure. This segmentation ensures security but also limits external reconstruction of full physical pathways when only partial documentation is available. Visibility within tracking systems depends heavily on classification access, meaning that full continuity of location records may not exist within publicly available documentation. Even when internal systems preserve detailed logs of movement and storage, those records may remain compartmentalized within restricted databases that are not included in declassified releases. Public-facing documentation often reflects summaries or partial references rather than complete custody sequences, resulting in fragmented visibility. This structural separation means that the absence of location data in public records does not necessarily indicate absence of tracking, but rather limited disclosure of existing systems. Extended custody arrangements for sensitive materials can persist for indeterminate periods without corresponding updates in publicly released records or summaries. Materials retained for long-term analysis or secure storage may remain within controlled environments for extended durations, during which their status is maintained internally, but not reflected in external reporting cycles. Over time, this creates a divergence between operational continuity and documented visibility, where ongoing custody does not produce publicly observable changes in record structure. As a result, the passage of time does not always correlate with increased transparency in available documentation. Loss of visibility within official or declassified records does not necessarily indicate removal of material from controlled systems, but often reflects structural limits in traceable reporting. Compartmentalized documentation frameworks are designed so that no single dataset provides a complete overview of all material movement, ensuring that sensitive information remains distributed across multiple controlled layers. This means that gaps in public records may arise from separation between internal documentation systems and external disclosure policies, rather than from physical disappearance. The distinction between missing records and missing materials becomes significant in interpreting what is and is not visible. Across these systems, storage is defined less by physical location and more by the administrative structures that govern movement, access, and classification. The material itself becomes part of a managed life cycle, in which its presence is continuously recorded within internal systems, even when external visibility is limited or absent. What appears as disappearance in public documentation may instead reflect a shift in where and how information is recorded, rather than an actual loss of physical custody. Over time, the structure of storage becomes inseparable from the structure of classification, with both operating as parallel systems of control. Custody pathways become increasingly difficult to reconstruct within accessible records, redirecting attention toward individuals who claim to have witnessed or been connected to these processes and later encountered scrutiny after speaking about them. Witnesses who faced pressure after speaking about recovery. Reports tied to recovery-related custody systems extend beyond logistical records into personal narratives that later circulated across overlapping official and informal channels. Over time, what begins as fragmented operational information becomes part of a broader informational ecosystem in which documentation, interpretation, and retelling interact in uneven ways. The movement of these accounts between systems does not preserve them in a fixed form. Instead, each transition introduces subtle shifts in emphasis, structure, and perceived importance. In this process, the original focus on physical recovery becomes less central, not through removal, but through gradual redistribution of attention across multiple forms of communication. Field-related recollections attributed to participants or observers include references to irregular material findings and environmental anomalies noted during or after retrieval operations. These descriptions, when considered in isolation, represent individual observational perspectives shaped by proximity, role, and situational awareness at the time of the events. The details often vary in specificity and focus, reflecting differences in what each observer was positioned to perceive. While some accounts emphasize environmental conditions or procedural activity, others concentrate on unusual physical elements, creating a collection of observations that does not resolve into a single uniform description. Entry of such recollections into broader awareness occurs through multiple transmission routes, including structured briefings, secondary reporting chains, and retrospective documentation releases. Each route imposes its own formatting and contextual constraints, shaping how original statements are preserved or altered as they move outward from their point of origin. Structured briefings tend to condense detail for clarity, while secondary reporting may prioritize narrative coherence over technical precision. Retrospective documentation, meanwhile, often repositions earlier material within a broader interpretive framework, further distancing it from its initial observational context. Later summaries and contextual updates frequently reshape the framing of initial statements, altering emphasis while retaining only selected portions of original accounts. This process of reframing does not necessarily replace earlier descriptions, but it does shift their interpretive weight. Certain details may be highlighted as representative, while others are reduced to supporting context or omitted entirely from condensed versions. Over time, repeated reinterpretation across different stages of communication contributes to a gradual transformation in how the original material is understood, with emphasis increasingly placed on coherence rather than completeness. Follow-up engagement from individuals associated with early disclosures often decreases over time, with some refraining from further public clarification or elaboration. This reduction in participation can occur across different contexts and does not always follow a uniform pattern. In some cases, the absence of continued commentary leaves earlier statements as the primary reference point, while in others, partial updates or clarifications emerge without fully replacing the original accounts. The resulting informational structure becomes uneven, with varying degrees of detail depending on the availability and continuity of individual contributions. Recorded institutional reactions vary across cases, spanning formal acknowledgement, explicit denial, limited comment, or absence of direct response within available records. These differing response types reflect the range of possible institutional positions when addressing externally reported accounts. Formal acknowledgement may confirm limited aspects of an event, while denial may address specific claims without engaging broader context. Limited comment or non-response can leave interpretive space open, resulting in records that document engagement without fully resolving the underlying subject matter. Comparison across different source types shows that personal recollections, official summaries, and released documents frequently present partial but non-identical versions of the same reported events. These variations do not necessarily indicate contradiction in a strict sense, but rather reflect differences in purpose, context, and level of detail across each source type. Personal recollections prioritize experiential detail, official summaries emphasize structured clarity, and released documents reflect the constraints of classification and disclosure. When viewed collectively, these differences produce a layered informational environment in which no single version fully encompasses the entire scope of reported material. Narratives of this nature continue to circulate despite inconsistencies, sustained by gaps in synthesis across the full range of available documentation. The persistence of these accounts is not dependent on uniform agreement between sources, but rather on the continued absence of a comprehensive framework that reconciles all available versions into a single coherent narrative. As a result, multiple interpretations coexist, each supported by partial evidence or selective emphasis, without achieving full convergence across the broader informational landscape. These narratives continue to circulate without convergence across documentation and interpretation, gradually shifting attention toward the broader evolution of how public understanding distanced itself from the physical details of the reported recovery. How public narratives shifted away from the recovery. Statements describing scrutiny faced after discussing recovery-related events later entered wider informational channels where they were processed alongside broader institutional and public commentary. Once this shift occurs, the material is no longer confined to its original operational context, but becomes part of a distributed communication environment where information is repeatedly reorganized, summarized, and reintroduced through different layers of transmission. In this environment, the original focus on physical recovery details begins to compete with interpretive frameworks that prioritize clarity, accessibility, and narrative structure over technical specificity. What was once a collection of direct observational references gradually becomes part of a broader informational pattern shaped by how systems handle complexity. Material originating from recovery-related reporting typically moves into public awareness through layered distribution systems that include formal releases, secondary reporting, and retrospective inclusion in compiled records. Each stage in this movement introduces structural adjustments that influence how the information is presented and understood. Formal channels tend to prioritize consistency and controlled language, while secondary reporting often reframes material for general audiences, reducing technical density. Retrospective compilations then reorganize earlier content into consolidated narratives that reflect later interpretive priorities rather than initial observational detail. Across these stages, the continuity of original specificity becomes increasingly fragmented. Initial public descriptions of recovery-related material tend to preserve limited fragments of detail, while restructuring complex observations into more accessible narrative forms. This process is not necessarily a distortion of content, but a transformation driven by the need to communicate across different levels of understanding. Technical descriptions that may have been precise in origin are often condensed into simplified representations that emphasize general characteristics rather than exact properties. As a result, early accounts serve as partial reflections of more complex underlying material rather than complete reproductions of it. Reporting systems operating between technical sources and public audiences frequently translate specialized descriptions into simplified accounts that prioritize clarity over precision. This translation process is a structural feature of communication systems that bridge specialized knowledge and general readership. In doing so, it reduces reliance on technical terminology and replaces it with broader conceptual language that is more widely accessible. While this increases comprehension, it also reduces the level of detail preserved in public-facing narratives, gradually shifting attention away from the specific attributes of the original material. Repeated circulation of similar summaries across multiple outlets contributes to the stabilization of certain interpretations, even when original details remain varied or incomplete. Once a particular framing becomes widely repeated, it gains structural reinforcement through repetition, rather than through verification of underlying detail. This repetition does not necessarily originate from a single source, but emerges through convergence across multiple reporting pathways. As these reinforced interpretations circulate, they begin to define the dominant version of events in public understanding, regardless of the complexity present in earlier accounts. Official communication frameworks often employ standardized terminology that compresses detailed observations into broader categories designed for consistency across multiple contexts. This standardization serves an administrative function, allowing complex information to be communicated in a controlled and uniform manner. However, it also reduces variation in descriptive detail, grouping distinct observations into generalized classifications. Over time, this contributes to a narrowing of informational specificity, where nuanced differences between accounts become less visible within the dominant structure of official language. As information passes through successive stages of summarization, detailed technical or observational elements are often reduced into generalized descriptors that carry less specificity. Each stage of condensation removes certain layers of detail, while preserving only those elements considered essential for broader understanding. This process does not eliminate the original information entirely, but it redistributes it across different levels of abstraction. The result is a layered structure in which high-level summaries dominate public visibility, while lower-level details remain embedded in less accessible records. Parallel narrative versions develop across different sources, producing overlapping but non-identical interpretations that coexist without full reconciliation. These versions may draw from shared origins but diverge as they are adapted to different contexts, purposes, or audiences. In some cases, discrepancies arise from differences in emphasis, while in others they reflect structural limitations in available information. The coexistence of these versions creates a fragmented interpretive environment in which no single narrative fully resolves all variations present across sources. Narratives of this nature continue to circulate despite inconsistencies, sustained by gaps in synthesis across the full range of available documentation. The persistence of these accounts is supported not by uniform agreement, but by the absence of a single consolidated framework that fully integrates all existing versions into a complete account. As a result, multiple interpretations remain active within the broader informational space, each reflecting partial perspectives shaped by different stages of transmission and framing. These narratives continue to circulate without convergence across documentation and interpretation, gradually shifting attention toward the broader evolution of how public understanding distanced itself from the physical details of the reported recovery. Why no complete record of the recovery was ever released. Public attention moving away from physical recovery details leaves unresolved questions regarding why no unified archival record consolidating the full sequence of events has ever been made available. What becomes central at this stage of analysis is not the presence of individual reports or partial references, but the absence of a single continuous document that ties together recovery, handling, evaluation, and final disposition into one coherent archival structure. In most documented government and military operations involving material collection, even highly sensitive cases generate layered records that can later be partially reconstructed through declassification or internal review. The expectation of continuity is therefore not unusual. It is a standard outcome of structured administrative systems designed to track controlled material across multiple stages. Standard institutional operations involving material handling typically generate multiple layers of documentation that record movement, evaluation, and classification at different stages of processing. These layers often include initial field reports, transfer logs, laboratory assessments, and storage assignments, each created for specific operational purposes. While each document may serve a narrow function, together they form a traceable sequence that allows events to be reconstructed with varying degrees of completeness. In cases involving sensitive material, the documentation may be heavily restricted, but the underlying structure of a record creation generally remains intact, even if access to it is limited. Structured administrative systems are generally designed to preserve sequential traceability through logs that connect initial acquisition with subsequent transfer and storage activity. This traceability is not dependent on a single document, but is instead distributed across interconnected records that track custody over time. Each transition point in handling typically generates an entry that marks responsibility and location, ensuring that movement can be audited internally even when external visibility is restricted. In principle, this creates a continuous chain of documentation that can be followed if full access to the system is available. Different organizational units involved in handling sensitive material often maintain separate records that reflect their specific operational responsibilities rather than a unified narrative. Field operations may document recovery conditions, technical units may focus on material properties, and administrative branches may track classification status and storage assignments. These parallel record streams are not always designed to merge into a single comprehensive account, as each serves a distinct function within the broader system. As a result, even complete internal documentation may exist in segmented form rather than as a consolidated file. Access to recorded material is governed by classification thresholds that determine which portions of documentation are available for public release and which remain restricted. These thresholds are based on sensitivity assessments that evaluate potential risks associated with disclosure, including national security considerations and operational integrity. Information that meets certain criteria may remain classified indefinitely or be released only in a heavily redacted form. This creates a boundary between what is recorded internally and what is permitted to enter public archival systems. Released archival material frequently represents selected segments of larger datasets, shaped by review processes that filter content based on sensitivity and disclosure policy constraints. Declassification procedures are not designed to reconstruct complete operational histories, but to release information that can be safely made public without compromising restricted systems. As a result, available documents may provide partial insight into events without reflecting the full scope of underlying records. The absence of continuity in release material therefore reflects procedural filtering rather than necessarily indicating absence of documentation. Internal record retention systems may preserve extensive documentation that is never fully transferred into publicly accessible archives due to long-term classification status. These retention systems are designed to maintain institutional memory while restricting external access, ensuring that sensitive information remains available for internal reference without being exposed through public channels. Over extended periods, this can result in large bodies of documentation that exist outside the scope of public archival reconstruction. The presence of retained records does not guarantee their visibility, even under formal review processes. Structural design choices within record-keeping frameworks can produce discontinuities in accessible information without requiring loss or destruction of underlying documentation. Because records are distributed across multiple systems, governed by different access rules, and subject to varying classification levels, gaps can emerge in what is publicly reconstructible. These gaps are not necessarily anomalies, but can be inherent features of how compartmentalized documentation systems function. The architecture of separation itself can limit the ability to assemble a complete narrative from available fragments. Across these conditions, the absence of a unified record is better understood as a structural outcome of distributed documentation, classification controls, and segmented archival design rather than a single identifiable omission. The system produces records continuously, but not all records are designed to converge into a publicly visible whole. What remains accessible is therefore a curated and partial representation of a larger informational structure that cannot be fully observed from the outside. Increasing visibility of archival discontinuities across available records shifts attention toward institutional silence surrounding physical evidence and the reasons certain material categories remain outside direct public acknowledgement. The CIA's silence on physical evidence from Roswell. Examination of incomplete archival structures naturally redirects focus toward institutional communication patterns that omit direct reference to physical evidence within publicly released material. At this stage of analysis, attention is no longer centered on what has been documented or partially disclosed, but on what remains consistently absent from formal acknowledgement despite repeated public interest in the subject. Institutional communication does not operate solely through what is stated. It also operates through what is consistently not addressed, particularly in cases involving historically sensitive or classified subject matter. This form of structured omission becomes increasingly relevant when reviewing long-term patterns across official records. Official communications concerning unexplained recovery-related topics typically confine discussion to general policy language rather than specific descriptions of physical artifacts or materials. This tendency reflects a broader institutional preference for framing sensitive topics within established categories that avoid introducing granular technical detail into public discourse. In practice, this means that statements are often structured around procedural language, oversight mechanisms, or general references to investigative categories, rather than explicit engagement with material claims. The result is a communication style that remains consistent in tone and structure, even when addressing topics that originate from highly specific historical events. Direct references to recovered physical objects are notably absent from formal institutional statements that otherwise address related categories of aerial or unidentified phenomena. While certain documents acknowledge the existence of investigative frameworks, reporting systems, or historical interest in unidentified aerial observations, they do not extend those references into descriptions of tangible recovered materials. This separation between acknowledgement of phenomena and acknowledgement of physical evidence creates a distinct boundary within institutional communication, where one category is discussed while the other remains outside direct articulation. The absence itself becomes a recurring feature across multiple forms of documentation. Institutional messaging operates within defined disclosure frameworks that regulate the scope, terminology, and specificity of information permitted for public release. These frameworks are structured to ensure consistency in communication while maintaining control over sensitive subject areas. As a result, the language used in official statements is shaped not only by what is known internally, but also by what is authorized for external disclosure. This creates an environment in which certain topics may be indirectly referenced through broader categories, while specific material details remain excluded from formal public articulation. Released materials under declassification processes tend to reflect pre-existing categorical references rather than introducing new substantive detail regarding physical evidence. In many cases, declassified documents provide insight into procedural context, administrative structure, or historical classification systems, while maintaining the original limitations placed on more sensitive content. This means that declassification often reveals how information was managed, but not necessarily the full content of what was managed. The resulting record is therefore informative in structure, but limited in its ability to expand upon certain categories of interest. Across multiple publicly accessible documents, similar patterns emerge in which certain subject areas are consistently referenced without direct elaboration or material confirmation. These patterns are observable through repeated engagement with general themes such as unidentified phenomena or historical investigative programs, while avoiding detailed discussion of physical evidence claims. The repetition of this structural approach across different time periods and document types suggests a stable communication boundary that remains unchanged despite evolving public discourse. This consistency reinforces the distinction between acknowledgement of subject areas and acknowledgement of physical specifics. Absence of direct institutional clarification in key areas contributes to expanded interpretive space within the external analysis and public discussion frameworks. When formal statements do not directly address specific categories of inquiry, external interpretation naturally becomes more varied, drawing from available fragments of information, contextual inference, and historical association. This does not necessarily indicate the presence of additional undisclosed material within public records, but it does reflect the structural effect of limited direct engagement with certain topics. The absence of clarification thus becomes a factor in how broader narratives are constructed outside institutional boundaries. Distinction between procedural disclosure limits and interpretive framing becomes increasingly significant when evaluating the structural nature of informational gaps. Procedural limits refer to formal constraints governing what can be released, while interpretive framing refers to how released information is structured and presented. These two factors operate independently, but often intersect in shaping public understanding of complex or sensitive subjects. In cases where physical evidence is not directly addressed, the interaction between these constraints becomes particularly relevant to understanding how informational boundaries are formed and maintained. Accumulation of consistently unaddressed categories within institutional communication frameworks ultimately narrows attention toward the broader set of elements that remain outside formal accounting and complete public reconstruction. This narrowing does not arise from a single omission, but from repeated structural patterns in which certain subject areas remain consistently beyond direct articulation. As these patterns persist across multiple forms of documentation, they define the limits of what is publicly reconstructible from institutional records alone. The result is a boundary that is observable not through what is stated, but through what remains continuously unspoken. The persistence of these structural absences across institutional communication ultimately shifts analytical focus toward categories of material and informational elements that have never been fully integrated into official public explanation. What remains unaccounted for? Bringing together the full range of claims, records, and omissions associated with the reported recovery requires treating all available material as a single fragmented informational field, rather than a unified historical account. At this stage, the objective is not to expand the scope of inquiry, but to organize what has already been presented across multiple forms of documentation, testimony, and institutional framing into a coherent analytical structure. Each layer of information reflects a different level of access, interpretation, and preservation. Yet none of them individually offers a complete reconstruction of the reported events. What emerges instead is a layered configuration of partial perspectives that overlap in certain areas while diverging in others, leaving gaps that remain consistent across all examined categories. Organized synthesis of existing accounts reveals recurring references to recovery events, material handling, and investigative involvement without introducing additional verified detail beyond established documentation. These references appear across different types of sources, including retrospective summaries, fragmented reports, and contextual references embedded within broader discussions of unidentified phenomena. While the thematic consistency of these references suggests a shared underlying subject, the lack of uniform detail prevents them from forming a singular, fully defined account. Instead, they function as recurring markers within a broader narrative structure that remains incomplete at the level of specific verification. Repeated descriptions found across multiple sources converge on general assertions, involving retrieval activity and subsequent examination, though the level of specificity varies significantly between accounts. Some descriptions focus on procedural elements, while others emphasize observational or contextual aspects, resulting in a range of interpretive emphasis that does not resolve into a single standardized narrative. This variation is not unusual in complex historical or classified contexts, where different reporting conditions and informational constraints influence how events are recorded. However, the persistence of general convergence without detailed alignment underscores the structural limits of available material. Existing records preserved in public and partial archival form provide procedural context, but stop short of confirming comprehensive physical characteristics or complete material inventories. These records often describe administrative processes, classification structures, or investigative frameworks, but do not extend into fully detailed descriptions of physical evidence attributed to the reported recovery. As a result, they function more as contextual frameworks than complete evidentiary accounts. The absence of full material specificity within these records becomes a defining characteristic of their informational scope, rather than an incidental omission. Comparative analysis of available materials shows overlapping themes expressed through differing levels of detail, emphasis, and structural framing depending on the source type. Personal accounts tend to reflect experiential detail, institutional references prioritize procedural language, and compiled summaries emphasize coherence over specificity. When viewed collectively, these differences do not necessarily contradict one another, but they also do not align into a unified descriptive structure. Instead, they form a distributed narrative environment in which each source contributes partial insight without resolving the full scope of reported claims. No publicly accessible dataset or consolidated archive provides independently verifiable confirmation of the full physical scope attributed to the reported recovery. While fragments of related documentation exist across various contexts, none present a complete or independently verifiable inventory of materials, conditions, or outcomes associated with the event as described in broader narratives. This absence does not negate the existence of related references, but it does define the boundary between what is accessible and what is not fully documented in a verifiable form. The result is a persistent separation between reference material and confirmed material record. Officially released material consistently acknowledges investigative categories while maintaining limited engagement with direct references to specific physical evidence claims. In many cases, institutional language focuses on general subject classifications, procedural history, or investigative frameworks, rather than detailed engagement with material-level assertions. This creates a consistent pattern in which subject matter is recognized in broad terms, while remaining undefined in specific physical detail. The structure of this communication approach reinforces a distinction between acknowledgement of inquiry and confirmation of content. Cumulative examination of all prior sections reveals that informational discontinuities persist across documentation, testimony, and public interpretation, without convergence into a complete record. These discontinuities are not confined to a single category of source, but appear across multiple layers of information, including formal records, secondary reporting, and retrospective synthesis. The persistence of these gaps indicates that the available material represents a partial aggregation of related references rather than a complete reconstruction of events. Each layer contributes to the overall picture, but none eliminates the boundaries of what remains unverified or absent. What ultimately remains is a structured boundary between recorded information, reported interpretation, and elements that cannot be fully reconciled within the scope of available evidence.